Section 1. The Vaults, What They Never Told You. There is something deeply unsettling about a door that was never meant to open. Somewhere beneath the broken earth of the American wasteland, concrete walls press in around thousands of people who walked willingly into the dark. They brought their families. They brought their children. They brought their photographs and their favorite records, and whatever small pieces of a life they thought might survive the end of everything. And somewhere far above them, the sky was on fire. That was the promise, the great lie dressed up in cheerful yellow paint and a grinning mascot with his thumb pointed upward. Vault-Tec. The name itself carries this odd weight when you say it out loud, something between a pharmaceutical company and a government program. Something clinical, something clean, something that made ordinary people feel like they had a plan when everything else was falling apart. The vaults were sold as salvation, underground cities, self-contained and self-sustaining, built to carry American civilization through the worst of the nuclear storm until the world outside could safely breathe again. Families paid enormous sums of money for a slot in one. Waiting lists stretched for years. People mortgaged their houses, sold their cars, gave up things they couldn't afford to give up, all for the chance to stand behind one of those massive steel doors when the bombs eventually fell. And the bombs did fall. On the 23rd of October, 2077, 2 hours of coordinated nuclear exchange erased most of what humanity had spent centuries building. Cities vanished in seconds. Everything familiar was rearranged into something alien and radioactive and deeply hostile to life. The people inside the vaults survived, most of them, anyway. What they didn't know, what almost none of them ever truly understood, was that the vaults were never really shelters. They were laboratories. Every single one of them, designed from the ground up, not to protect, but to observe. The cheerful yellow corridors, and the organized bunk rooms, and the community spaces, and the overseers with their clipboards, all of it was a container. A controlled environment. A very expensive cage, built at government expense for reasons that had nothing to do with the people locked inside. The Vault-Tec Corporation, working in concert with the Enclave, a shadow faction of the pre-war United States government, needed data. Enormous quantities of it, gathered under conditions that would never have been ethically approved. How do people behave under extreme, long-term isolation? What happens to a community when its social contract breaks down? How does the human body and mind respond to carefully controlled stress, to engineered scarcity, to the introduction of specific psychological pressures over generations? They needed to know all of this, and the vaults were the instrument for finding out. Somewhere between 122 and 150 vaults were eventually constructed across the continental United States. Each was sealed against the outside world. Each contained a population of people who believed they were simply waiting out the worst. And each, almost without exception, was running its own specific experiment. Let's start with the ones that aren't talked about as often. Vault 106, located in the capital wasteland, had a modification built into its air filtration system. 10 days after the vault door sealed, psychoactive drugs were introduced into the air supply. The residents breathed them in without any awareness of what was happening. Over generations, the population descended into a kind of collective psychosis, untethered from consensus reality in a way that couldn't be attributed to any single cause because the cause was invisible and ubiquitous. By the time the outside world encountered what remained of Vault 106, the survivors were feral in a very specific way, not simply violent from desperation, but genuinely disconnected from the kind of shared understanding that makes human cooperation possible. Whatever Vault-Tec was measuring had run its course, and what it left behind was tragedy. Vault 92, also in the capital wasteland, was publicly described as a sanctuary for musicians, the world's finest players, gathered together to preserve the cultural heritage of American music. It sounds almost romantic when you frame it that way. In practice, the musicians were test subjects for white noise experiments designed to trigger violent behavior at specific intervals. The Vault's research was focused on the creation of a controllable berserker state. Could white noise frequencies be used to switch aggression on and off in soldiers? The residents of Vault 92 had no idea they were guinea pigs. They thought they were playing concerts in an underground haven. The notes and holotapes left behind described the horror of watching people they knew and cared about suddenly turn violent, with no warning and no apparent cause, and then return to normal as if nothing had happened. The cycle continued until the violence became permanent. Vault 11, located out in the Mojave, ran perhaps the cruelest experiment of all, and it is worth sitting with the details for a moment. The vault's residents were told, upon sealing, that one person from the population had to be selected for sacrifice each year. If the sacrifice was made willingly, the vault would be maintained. If no one was chosen, everyone would die. The overseer's computer would deliver this message at the appropriate interval, and the community would have to decide. No further information was provided. What the residents were never told was that the message was false. No maintenance consequence was tied to the sacrifice. The whole premise was invented. Vault-Tec wanted to know how a community would handle this kind of forced moral catastrophe. Who would they choose? How would they justify it? What systems of power would emerge around the selection process? And how long it would take before people refused? The answer to that last question took years. Sacrifice after sacrifice was made. Social hierarchies formed around the selection. Factions emerged. People with influence found ways to steer suspicion toward those without it. The powerful protected themselves and rationalized the killing of the vulnerable as necessary. This pattern held for a long time. Eventually, only 5 people remained from the original population. And those 5 people made a different choice. They refused. They sat together and decided that they would rather die than choose another name. And when they made that refusal, the Vault's computer finally told them the truth. The sacrifice had never been required. They were, according to the message, shining examples of humanity for their choice. Everyone who had been sacrificed before them had died for nothing. The remaining 5 survivors apparently took their own lives after receiving this information. But records suggest that at least one person survived. A detail buried in the game's files, a character model, and some partial notes indicating that someone walked out of Vault 11, found themselves alone in the desert, and the story simply stops there. What that person did next, whether they found some kind of peace, or whether the knowledge they carried destroyed them, is one of those questions the wasteland leaves permanently unanswered. Vault 108 has a different quality of horror, quieter in some ways, more absurd in others. Located in the capital wasteland, it was designed around 2 simultaneous crises. The Vault's overseer was terminally ill with a short timeline, and the Vault's power systems were set to fail within 20 years. The Vault also contained a cloning lab. At some point, someone cloned a resident named Gary. Then, they cloned him again, then again and again, until the Vault was overrun with genetically identical men who communicated almost exclusively through variations of a single word. By the time anyone from outside reaches Vault 108, there is nothing left inside but Gary's, and the experience of walking through those corridors, encountering only this one repeated face, is genuinely unnerving in a way that's difficult to fully articulate. Whatever Vault-Tec was hoping to learn from this experiment presumably died with the original overseer. Vault 87 in the capital wasteland was used for early forced evolutionary virus testing. The residents who went in there were not researchers. They were subjects. They were transformed, forcibly and against their will, into the first generation of supermutants found in the capital wasteland. The green-skinned, hulking creatures that wander the ruins of Washington are the descendants of those people. Every one of them was once someone who paid for a vault slot, who stood in line, who went underground thinking they were going to survive. That origin story never fully leaves the creature when you encounter it. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth is interesting precisely because it nearly deviated from the pattern. The vault was designed to use its residents as test subjects for disease research, exposing them to various pathogens while searching for universal cures. But the overseer assigned to the vault found the mandate unconscionable and spent years secretly sabotaging the research systems while maintaining the illusion of compliance for the records being transmitted to Vault-Tec. Because of her, the residents lived normal lives. The secret lab beneath Vault 81 continued running experiments, but only on a robotic system rather than on people. The overseer died before she could fully dismantle the research apparatus, and the remnants of that underground lab contain the only remaining active pathogen sample, a genuinely dangerous piece of pre-war science, preserved almost by accident beneath a vault that turned out to be, by historical standards, one of the more humane underground communities in existence. Vault 75, hidden beneath a middle school in Malden, Massachusetts, had an especially grim purpose. Children were recruited into the vault under the cover of a legitimate school. The genuine shelter extended only to the level where children's parents and guardians lived above that threshold. Unbeknownst to the adults, was a research facility dedicated to genetic optimization. Children who reached a certain age were evaluated. Those who showed promising genetic potential were retained and trained as soldiers. Those who did not pass the evaluation were killed. The facility was producing a pool of genetically superior human subjects, refining the pool with each generation, discarding what didn't meet specifications. The parents never knew. They lived their lives below, raising families in what seemed like a functioning vault, while their children were being selected and sorted and eliminated above them. Then there are the vaults that failed in more mundane ways, and those have their own kind of weight. Vault 15 in California was populated deliberately with an ideologically diverse mix of residents, people of different backgrounds, politics, and beliefs, crammed together with the explicit intention of studying the resulting conflict. The residents eventually fragmented, with some founding the community of Shady Sands, which grew into the new California Republic, while others formed the raider gangs that would trouble the Mojave for generations. Vault 12, in Bakersfield, had a door that was deliberately designed not to seal properly. The intention was to study radiation exposure in a contained population. The residents became ghouls. The city of Necropolis was founded by the survivors, a community of the irradiated and transformed, people who had gone underground to escape radiation and were instead bathed in it, who emerged changed in ways that defied easy classification, not quite what they were before, but more alive than anything the word undead suggests. All of this was known to the people who designed it. They sat in rooms and made decisions about what to do to these populations, and they wrote their findings in documents that got buried under centuries of dust, and the vaults sealed, and the people inside them began to live the experiments designed for them. The thing that makes the vault system genuinely haunting isn't any single experiment. It's the scale of the deception. It's the fact that every person who walked willingly into those corridors did so out of love. Love for their families, love for the future, fear of what the world was becoming, and hope that something survivable lay on the other side of those enormous steel doors. They trusted, they paid, they went inside, and the door closed behind them. Wherever you are watching this from, drop a comment below. I'd love to know your location and what time it is there. And if this kind of slow, deep dive lore content is something you enjoy, subscribing means you'll catch every future video. It takes about 3 seconds, and it helps more than you'd think. Section 2. The Institute and its Deepest Secrets. Beneath the ruins of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or what remained of it after the bombs and the centuries, something had been growing in the dark. The people of the Commonwealth called it the Institute. They spoke about it the way people speak about something they can't fully see and can't fully explain, in hushed voices, with that particular quality of dread that attaches to things you can only half understand. They called its agents synths, and they feared them with a specific intensity because synths looked exactly like people. They spoke in the same cadences, wore the same expressions, responded to kindness and cruelty with recognizable human patterns. You could share a meal with one, you could live beside one for years, and at some point it might receive a signal, or remember something it wasn't supposed to remember, and whatever it had been to you would become suddenly and terribly uncertain. The Institute's origins trace back to what survived of MIT after the Great War. A group of scientists and academics, sheltered in the sublevels of the old campus, found themselves in possession of extraordinary knowledge and extraordinary isolation. The Commonwealth around them was chaotic and violent, and the Institute's founders made a decision largely implicit, rarely written down plainly, that they would not engage with that chaos. They would go further underground in every sense of the phrase. They would focus on research. They would preserve and advance scientific knowledge with no particular obligation to the population, scratching out lives in the ruins above their heads. Over generations, this choice hardened into ideology. The Institute scientists became convinced of their own separateness from the wasteland, not simply isolated from it, but qualitatively different from it. They referred to the surface world as the Commonwealth, as if naming it separately from their own existence reinforced the distinction. They referred to the people living on the surface with a kind of detached clinical language that stripped them of personhood in small but consistent ways. By the time of Fallout 4's story, the Institute had been operating in this mode for approximately 150 years. Its internal structure was organized into four main divisions: advanced systems, bioscience, robotics, and synth retention. Each division had its own culture, its own internal hierarchies, its own relationship to the ethical questions that the Institute as a whole seemed constitutionally incapable of addressing directly. The Synthetic Life Program was the Institute's most extraordinary achievement and its most profound ethical catastrophe. It began, as most catastrophes do, with reasonable intentions. First-generation synths were basic mechanical frames, functional robots that could be directed to perform tasks. Second-generation synths added synthetic flesh over the mechanical skeleton, producing something more human in appearance but still fundamentally mechanical in cognition. The jump to third-generation synths required a different approach entirely. The Institute needed biological material. They needed, specifically, a source of human DNA that they could use as a template for synthetic biology, something that would allow them to create synths that were truly indistinguishable from humans at the cellular level. The solution they landed on was Sean, the infant son of the Vault-Frozen Soul survivor, kidnapped as part of an Institute operation shortly before the game's story begins. Sean's pre-war DNA, unspoiled by post-war radiation, became the genetic foundation for every third-generation synth the Institute ever created. Every synth that ever walked through the Commonwealth, every infiltrator and every courser, and every confused, escaped synth trying to understand what it was, all of them were made from variations of that one child's genetic material. This is a detail that only lands fully when you understand what the Institute did next. They raised Sean. They gave him education and responsibility, and eventually leadership. They let him grow old inside the Institute while his parent remained frozen. And when Sean was dying, already an elderly man riddled with terminal cancer, he arranged to have his parent thawed out 210 years after the bombs fell and set loose in the Commonwealth specifically to find him, not to save him, not because Sean needed rescuing, because Sean, who by that point had become father, the Institute's director, wanted to observe what the soul survivor would do, whether they would search, whether they would maintain their humanity or abandon it. The entire journey was an experiment designed by a child who grew old in a laboratory for a parent who had been sleeping in ice while the world ended. The coursers were the Institute's enforcement arm on the surface, and they deserve particular attention because of what they reveal about the organization's moral architecture. A courser was a third-generation synth who had been selected from the general synth population based on specific behavioral traits, tenacity, fearlessness, independence, and then subjected to a training regimen that turned those traits toward hunters' instincts. They operated alone in the Commonwealth, tracking escaped synths, neutralizing threats, and returning to the Institute through a relay system embedded in a chip inside each courser's brain. When a courser located an escaped synth, they used a recall code to wipe the synth's memory and render it inert. Then the synth was brought back, its neural pathways repaired or discarded, and returned to service with no memory of its time on the surface. In those cases where the memory repair couldn't be completed, the synth was disposed of. The language in that last sentence is deliberate. The Institute used the word disposed of. The implication of what that meant, what it meant in terms of what the Institute believed about the things it was creating, cuts to the heart of the faction's central contradiction. Were synths people? The Institute's official position was clearly no. They were machines. Sophisticated ones, but machines. The word android had been deliberately phased out of Institute vocabulary at Sean's insistence, replaced with synth, partly because android carries too much science fiction weight. Too many literary associations with artificial beings who develop personhood. But the Institute's own behavior complicated this position constantly. The training process for coursers explicitly selected for intelligence, individuality, and independence traits that, in humans, we associate with personhood. The Synth Retention Bureau's internal documents describe synths who go rogue in language that at times sounds less like describing a malfunctioning machine and more like describing someone who made a decision. Nick Valentine, the prototype second-generation synth encountered in Fallout 4, had been loaded with the full memories and personality of a pre-war detective named Nicholas Valentine, intended as a test of whether a synth could sustain a complex human psychological profile indefinitely. The experiment apparently exceeded its parameters. Nick retained not just the memories, but the emotional weight of those memories. The grief and the love and the complicated residue of a human life lived decades before the bombs fell. He escaped the institute. He became a person. He had a small detective agency and a secretary, and a philosophy about the wasteland that was distinctly, undeniably his own. The railroad existed as a direct consequence of the institute's work. A loosely organized network of agents and sympathizers who believed that synthetic humans, whatever the institute chose to call them, were sentient beings deserving of freedom. They ran an underground network, playing on the language of the historical Underground Railroad with deliberate intention, moving synths through safe houses and across checkpoint systems and out of the Institute's reach. Their headquarters was beneath the Old North Church. Their operations were perpetually endangered because any member of the railroad could themselves be a synth, could be infiltrated by a synth infiltrator who didn't know what it was, could be betrayed without any intention behind the betrayal. The relationship between the railroad and the Institute's internal population is one of the most quietly interesting aspects of the faction's lore. Not every Institute scientist was comfortable with the organization's methods. Some of them struggled with what they were doing in the same way that people in every morally compromised institution have always struggled quietly, ineffectively, without the language or the framework to name what was wrong. Brian Virgil, a scientist in the bioscience division, eventually defected entirely and fled to the glowing sea. His research notes, scattered through his former lab, describe a person watching the gap between what the Institute claimed to be and what it was doing become impossible to ignore. The Institute's underground complex was massive, extending far beneath the ruins of the old campus. Its design was deliberately deceptive. Nothing on the surface indicated its presence. The relay system that allowed personnel and synths to teleport in and out was the organization's most powerful security feature. You couldn't find the Institute on a map. You couldn't walk up to it. The only way in was through the relay, which required a specific chip from a dead courser and an extraordinary amount of engineering work to access even once. Inside, the Institute was a strange and contradictory place. The residential areas had a clean, well-lit quality that felt deeply disconnected from the ruin above. Families lived there. Children were born there. People ate synthetic food and had arguments about lab allocations and complained about discontinued menu items in the cafeteria. The Institute's internal community had a shape and texture to it. People who loved each other, who had petty grievances and private ambitions, who were living what amounted to normal lives in the depths of a scientific organization that was doing terrible things. The cafeteria argument is worth pausing on. In one corner of the Institute's concourse, you can encounter a scientist who is genuinely, visibly upset about a discontinued food supplement. The mundanity of this complaint, sitting inside an organization that kidnapped children and replaced people's loved ones with synthetic copies, is one of those details that the Fallout series handles with quiet excellence. Evil is rarely performed by people who think of themselves as evil. It's performed by people who are also annoyed about their lunch options, who go home and love their families, who have genuine friendships and real kindness toward people inside their immediate circle. The Institute's residents were not monsters. They were ordinary people inside a system that had made monstrous decisions so far back in the organization's history that no single person still alive felt directly responsible for them. The question of what the Institute was ultimately trying to accomplish is genuinely unresolved in the lore. Sean's stated vision was a future in which the Institute's scientific capabilities would gradually transform the surface world, elevating humanity through technology. His specific plan involved expanding synth production to the point where the Institute could begin replacing key positions throughout Commonwealth society, guiding the wasteland toward stability through quiet, unannounced substitution. Whether anyone else in the Institute fully shared this vision, or whether they would have had the capacity to execute it after Sean's death from cancer, is one of those questions that the story leaves hanging. What the story does resolve, in every possible playthrough where the Institute ends, is that 150 years of choosing isolation over engagement had left the organization brittle in specific ways. The Institute had extraordinary knowledge and extraordinary capability, and it had no functional relationship with the world outside its walls. It had never built anything that involved other people's consent. Its plans for the future were plans for a future it would engineer, not negotiate, not propose, not offer as a choice. When that approach encountered resistance from the Brotherhood, from the Railroad, from the Minutemen, from the sole survivor making a different choice than Sean expected, the Institute had no strategy for accommodation, only for containment. The relay went dark when the Institute ended. The synths who had been helped out by the Railroad came gradually to understand that the organization that had made them was gone. Nick Valentine, still living his detective's life in Diamond City, still carrying the full emotional weight of a dead man's memories, continued to exist in a wasteland that no longer had a name for what he was. Section 3. The Brotherhood of Steel's Hidden Agenda. The story begins at a military base in California, and it begins with a man who discovered something he wasn't supposed to know. Captain Roger Maxson was assigned to the Mariposa military base in January of 2076, part of a security detail protecting a group of scientists working on classified government research. What the research actually was hadn't been fully explained to Maxson or his unit, which is, when you think about it, exactly the kind of institutional blindness that tends to precede catastrophe. They were soldiers. They guarded the perimeter. The science was someone else's concern. What Maxson discovered, through the course of doing his job, was that the scientists at Mariposa were conducting human experiments with the forced evolutionary virus. Real people, taken from outside, brought into the base and subjected to FEV without their knowledge or consent. The effects were documented carefully. The results were filed. The people subjected to the process were disposed of when their usefulness as data had been exhausted. This was ordered by the United States government. The chain of command that Maxson had served his entire military life ran directly back to the decision to do this to people. His commanding officer, Colonel Spindell, processed this information and then had a complete psychological breakdown. He killed himself shortly afterward, leaving Maxson in effective command of a situation with no clear resolution. What Maxson did next was extraordinary. He executed the remaining scientists, declared himself and his unit in a state of secession from the United States of America, and began transmitting a radio broadcast announcing what had happened and why. He identified himself by name. He explained the experiments. He said plainly that the United States government had lost its right to his service. 3 days later, the bombs fell. There's something almost unbearably ironic about that timeline. Maxson spent 3 days broadcasting a rebellion against a government that was about to cease to exist in 2 hours of nuclear exchange. He had staked everything on a moral principle that what the government was doing was wrong enough to walk away from, regardless of consequence, and the consequence arrived as an act of history rather than as a military court. Marshall, the government he was defecting from burned in the same fire that burned everything else. Maxson led his unit and their families out of Mariposa and toward the Lost Hills Bunker, a government facility in California. The journey was hard. People died along the way, including, according to the Fallout Bible, Maxson's wife. By the time the survivors reached Lost Hills, they were a small group of people who had survived multiple catastrophes through a combination of military discipline and extraordinary luck. What Maxson built at Lost Hills was an institution shaped by the particular combination of things he had seen and believed. He had watched science deployed as a weapon against powerless people, and he had seen what happened when the most advanced technological capabilities of a civilization became tools of atrocity. His response was not to reject technology. His unit had the power armor and the weapons and the knowledge that came from military service at the cutting edge of pre-war America. His response was to claim guardianship of it. Technology was not inherently evil, but unconstrained technology, answering to no one, was genuinely dangerous. The Brotherhood would preserve it, control its dispersal, and prevent its misuse. He called the organization the Brotherhood of Steel, and the title system he developed borrowed deliberately from medieval chivalric orders: knights, paladins, scribes, elders. This wasn't accidental. It was a choice to frame the organization as something closer to a monastic order than a military unit, echoing the real-world parallel of monks who preserved classical knowledge through the collapse of the Roman Empire. The specific literary inspiration was the novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, in which a religious order dedicated to preserving scientific knowledge survives a nuclear catastrophe and several subsequent cycles of history. Maxon was consciously building something meant to last. What it became, over the 200+ years between Maxon's founding and the game's present day, is more complicated and in some ways more troubling. Maxon died of cancer in 2135, relatively young, having spent years building the Brotherhood's structure and ideology. His son, Maxon II, took over leadership as a teenager and moved the organization firmly toward isolationism. No more recruitment from outside, no more engagement with the surrounding wasteland except to acquire technology. The Brotherhood began to hoard. The progression from preventing misuse of technology to preventing anyone else from having any technology is subtle enough that it can happen without anyone deciding to make it happen, through a sequence of individual choices that each seem reasonable in context and collectively produce a transformation. By the time of the first Fallout game, the Brotherhood in California had become an organization that occasionally helped with specific threats, but fundamentally operated on the principle that power armor and advanced weapons belonged to them, and that the people of the wasteland should be grateful they weren't using these things against them. They had extensive vaults of technology that could have been used to rebuild civilization more quickly than it was being rebuilt, and they were not using it. The East Coast chapter, established under Elder Owen Lyons, took a different path. Lyons led an expedition east to recover technology, and instead encountered the horror of the super mutant threat building in the capital wasteland. His response was to shift the Brotherhood's mission protecting the people of the wasteland came first, and technology acquisition became secondary to that. This decision cost him his standing with the West Coast Council, who cut off communication and support. For years, the East Coast Brotherhood operated as an effectively independent entity, undermanned and undersupplied, committed to a purpose the home organization didn't recognize. The tension between these versions of the Brotherhood, the ideological hoarders who preserve knowledge without applying it, and the pragmatic protectors who engage with the world around them at the cost of ideological purity, runs through every game the faction appears in. Arthur Maxon, the last living descendant of the founder, eventually unified the East Coast Brotherhood and restored contact with the West, but the reunification came at the cost of Lyon's humanitarian direction. Under Arthur, the Brotherhood returned to something closer to its original ideological framework, adding a new element. Synths represented exactly the kind of dangerous, poorly understood technology that the Brotherhood existed to control. The Institute had to end. Synthetic humans could not be permitted to propagate beyond human control. What's genuinely interesting in the lore is how Arthur Maxon's personal history shapes his approach. He was sent to the East Coast as a child because it was considered safer for the last Maxon bloodline than the internal politics of the West Coast chapter. He was raised by Owen Lyons' people. He grew up among a version of the Brotherhood that believed in protecting people, and then he spent his adult life leading an institution that made itself harder and more focused and more willing to destroy things that didn't fit its categories. There are notes and logs scattered through the Pridwin that hint at the psychological cost of this. Maxon is not a simple figure, and the game doesn't entirely let him be one. The Hidden Valley bunker in the Mojave contains one of the more melancholy Brotherhood stories in the series. The Mojave chapter was nearly destroyed in a disastrous confrontation with the NCR at Helios 1, a facility they had chosen as a defensive position in a strategically catastrophic decision made by Elder Elijah, who would later appear in the Dead Money DLC as a figure whose brilliance had curdled into genuine dangerous obsession. After the defeat, Elder McNamara put the survivors under strict lockdown in Hidden Valley. When the courier finds them, they have been in that bunker for years, slowly losing people to scouting missions and deteriorating morale, slowly becoming irrelevant to a Mojave they no longer patrol. The bunker contains a remarkable collection of individual stories, Brotherhood members who joined for different reasons, who believe different things about what the organization is or should be, who carry different relationships to the ideology they were recruited into. Some of them are true believers, some are deeply doubtful. Some joined as children and have never known anything else. The Brotherhood of Steel, at any individual level, is much less monolithic than its institutional presentation suggests. Elder Elijah himself is worth dwelling on. Before the defeat at Helios 1, he was considered one of the Brotherhood's most brilliant technical minds. His disappearance during the battle was considered a loss, though the surviving members' feelings about him were complicated. His reappearance in the Sierra Madre reveals what that brilliance had become untethered from any institutional checks, a fixation on the Sierra Madre vault and its contents, a willingness to use other people as disposable instruments to achieve his goals, a certainty that the ends were significant enough to justify the means. There's a suggestion in the way he talks about technology that he has taken the Brotherhood's core ideology. Technology is precious and dangerous and must be controlled, and removed the part where must be controlled applied to himself. The Appalachian Brotherhood chapter, established in Fallout 76, began differently from all the others. It was founded not by Roger Maxson directly, but by Elizabeth Taggarty, a U.S. Army Ranger who received satellite transmissions from Maxson after the bombs fell. She accepted his vision for the organization and built a chapter from her surviving unit, absorbing other former military personnel who had lost their chain of command. This chapter fought the scorched plague with everything they had. By the time of Fallout 76's story, they are gone eliminated by a combination of the plague's spread and their own unsustainable losses, and what's left is their equipment and their logs, an archive of an organization that tried and failed to hold a line against something genuinely overwhelming. The logs from that period have a quality that distinguishes them from a lot of the game's written material. These are people who believed in what they were doing, who understood the stakes, who made hard decisions under extraordinary pressure, and who ultimately couldn't win. Their failure wasn't ideological. It was simply that the thing they were fighting was bigger than they were, and they didn't have enough of them, and eventually they ran out of time. What the Brotherhood of Steel ultimately represents in the Fallout universe is a recurring examination of what happens to institutions with genuine founding ideals over long periods of time. Maxson started with something real, a moral line he wouldn't cross, a vision of how technology's destructive power might be contained rather than unleashed again. The organization built around that line hardened and narrowed and drifted and split, and 200 years later, the people wearing the armor have very different relationships to the founding principles than Maxson himself would have recognized. Some of them would still have made him proud. Some of them would have horrified him. Section 4. The Mysterious Pre-War World. The world that ended on the 23rd of October 2077 is one of the most carefully constructed alternate histories in any game series, and it rewards slow attention. It forked from our own history somewhere in the mid-20th century. The exact point of divergence is never specified precisely, and different parts of the lore gesture toward different moments. But the broad shape is consistent. Post-World War II, America took a different technological trajectory, developing nuclear fusion rather than transistor-based computing, remaining culturally and aesthetically anchored in the mid-century style. The tailfins and the diners and the cheerful primary colors and the particular confident optimism of a society that believed it was going to colonize the stars. While the underlying geopolitical tensions of the Cold War grew darker and more extreme. This is the world's central aesthetic irony. It looks like a 1950s dream of the future, and it was built on structural violence that it never acknowledged. The cheerfulness of the Nuka-Cola billboards and the Vault-Tec pamphlets and the Mr. Handy advertisements is genuine. In a sense, the people who consumed this culture really did participate in its optimism, really did experience it as promising and exciting. And underneath that optimism, the American government was conducting unauthorized experiments on its own citizens, annexing Canada, deploying biological weapons in China, running shadow organizations dedicated to ensuring that the right people would survive the apocalypse it was privately certain was coming. The resource wars began in 2052 and represent the beginning of the end that the world could see approaching, but chose not to fully confront. Oil was running out. The global scramble for the remaining resources combined with existing political tensions to produce a cascade of escalating conflicts. The United Nations, overwhelmed and structurally incapable of managing this scale of simultaneous crisis, dissolved. The Middle East, stripped of oil by the accelerating depletion, became the site of extended conflict with European powers that ended without resolution. China and the United States maneuvered around each other in the Pacific, each watching the other's resource situation with something between predatory calculation and genuine desperation. By 2052, much of the civilian population of the United States was living under martial law, though this was not described in those terms. It was described as emergency security measures, temporary restrictions justified by the ongoing crisis, necessary precautions against the communist threat that could be lifted once conditions normalized. Conditions did not normalize. The restrictions remained in place and accumulated. Citizens reported their neighbors to government agencies. Phone calls were monitored. Thought police was not a metaphor. There were actual agencies dedicated to identifying and suppressing dissent, framed always as defense against foreign infiltration. Food was becoming contaminated well before the bombs fell. The illegal dumping of nuclear waste, widespread across the country, had leached into soil and water supplies. Nuka-Cola famously contained trace amounts of radioactive isotopes. The Nuka-Cola Quantum variant, with its distinctive blue glow, was notable for its mildly stimulant properties produced by a radioactive additive, which the company advertised as a feature. Seafood in particular had become dangerously irradiated. The people eating it generally didn't know in quantifiable detail how much this was affecting them. They knew things weren't quite right, that there was something exhausted and contaminated about the food supply, and they consumed it anyway because the alternative was not eating. Chinese intelligence had been conducting sabotage operations inside the United States for years before the Sino-American War formally began. Manufacturing facilities, research programs, infrastructure all targeted, all with varying degrees of success, all contributing to a general sense of vulnerability and paranoia that the government was more than happy to exploit politically. This was genuinely happening, which made it more difficult to distinguish from the conspiratorial thinking about communist infiltration that was itself a tool of political control. The annexation of Canada is one of those historical facts in the Fallout universe that gets mentioned casually in terminal entries and holotapes without full elaboration, which makes it feel more real rather than less. Canada was absorbed into the United States beginning around 2067, presented publicly as a necessary resource-sharing arrangement and experienced by Canadians as a military occupation that included public executions of protesters. Canadian resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations against the Alaskan pipeline until the Great War ended the conflict by ending almost everything. The matter-of-fact way this history is documented in the same bureaucratic language used to describe internal memos and budget requests gives it a quality that the more dramatic revelations don't always achieve. The forced evolutionary virus had its origins in the period leading up to the Great War, developed at Vault-Tec Corporation's research facilities, and later moved to the Mariposa military base for human trials. The virus was designed to modify genetic material in ways that would produce enhanced soldiers faster, stronger, more resistant to hostile environments, capable of surviving conditions that would kill an ordinary human being. The goal was to win the war against China by producing combatants who simply couldn't be beaten in the same terms as conventional military engagement. The science was extraordinary. The ethics were non-existent. And the virus, when it escaped its controlled environment and began propagating through contaminated water supplies and direct application by different parties over the subsequent decades, produced outcomes that no one had specifically designed and no one fully controlled. The master, originally a human scientist named Richard Moreau who was exposed to FEV through an accident at the Mariposa base, became something genuinely unusual, a creature whose intelligence had been dramatically amplified by the virus, who had absorbed the consciousness of other organisms and formed a kind of collective psychic entity, who developed a philosophy of forced evolution that he believed was genuinely beneficial for humanity. The super mutant army he built from FEV-dipped victims was, in his own understanding, an act of mercy. He was elevating humanity past its fragile biological limitations. That the process was involuntary, that his vision of what human beings should become was never asked for or agreed to, was not something he had the perspective to recognize as a problem. When the Vault Dweller presented him with evidence that FEV-exposed humans were uniformly sterile, that the super mutant army was a evolutionary dead end, incapable of producing the next generation that would inherit his transformed world, the Master understood what this meant for his plan and destroyed himself. This is one of the series' most remarkable moments. The primary antagonist of the first game can be talked out of continuing his campaign of destruction, not through violence, but through logical argument. He was wrong, and when shown proof of the wrongness, he chose to acknowledge it. The pre-war world had its other catastrophes building quietly alongside the primary political ones. A plague called the New Plague began spreading in the United States in the 2050s, transmitted in ways that weren't fully understood, killing people with a speed and lethality that the medical system struggled to respond to. The government used emergency powers to manage the response, which primarily meant controlling information about the outbreak's extent to prevent panic. Underground research projects attempted to develop treatments. Some of these projects involved methodologies that medical ethics would not have permitted the same pattern, at a smaller scale, that characterized the FEV research and the Vault experiments, and essentially every other corner of pre-war American science that was operating under wartime emergency justifications. Robert House was calculating all of this from his offices in Las Vegas. He had run the numbers. He understood with a specificity that he found himself unable to share with anyone without sounding like a specific kind of lunatic, that nuclear war was not merely possible but virtually certain on a timeline he could estimate. He began his preparations, the laser cannons on the Lucky 38, the Securitron army sealed beneath the building, the life support systems that would carry his consciousness through the decades of post-war chaos until he could reassert control. He had ordered the Platinum chip, a device that would upgrade his entire security network's operating software, scheduled for delivery on the 23rd of October, 2077. It arrived one day late. The ships delivered the nuclear warheads early on the morning of October 23rd. The Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System picked up the first launches at 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 4 minutes later, NORAD confirmation. At 9:26, the President of the United States ordered a retaliatory strike. A Chinese submarine called the Yangtze, positioned off the East Coast, launched all but one of its warheads. One failed to fire due to a malfunction, leaving it armed and sitting in Boston Harbor for the next 210 years. 2 hours later, the Great War was over. 2 hours. The civilization that had been building toward this moment for decades, that had conducted experiments and acquired resources and fought wars and built vaults and hidden shadow governments, all of that history led to 2 hours of fire, and then silence, and then the slow, painful process of figuring out what anything meant in the world that remained. The world before the Great War was not simply a world that happened to blow itself up. It was a world that had made choices, accumulated in small increments and large ones over decades, that pointed toward this outcome. The technology it developed, the political structures it built, the ethical corners it cut, for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time, all of it contributed. The nuclear fire was not an accident in the sense of being unforeseeable. It was an accident in the sense of being the culmination of a very long sequence of decisions, each of which had consequences that people either didn't think through or thought through and accepted. The wasteland that remains is living in the wreckage of those choices. Every raider camp and every settlement and every vault still running its decades-old experiment, all of it is the aftermath of a world that chose, over and over, the wrong things for reasons that probably seemed reasonable at the time. Section 4B. The Ghoul, humanity's most complicated legacy. The Ghoul is not a monster. This is the thing the wasteland keeps insisting on, in different voices, in different stories, across every game in the series. The Ghoul is a person who survived something they weren't supposed to survive and who has been living in the complicated aftermath of that survival ever since. The transformation itself is not fully understood even within the world of Fallout. High levels of radiation are necessary, but not sufficient. Radiation at sufficient doses kills people, and the vast majority of the population caught in the Great War's fallout simply died. The people who became ghouls had something else, some additional biological or genetic property that allowed their bodies to adapt rather than succumb. What that property is has never been definitively characterized in the lore. There are theories. Some suggest that pre-war genetic modification or FEV exposure plays a role. The Vault-Tec simulations of ghoulification that appear in some terminals suggest the corporation had theories about the mechanism, but their findings were proprietary and largely lost with everything else. What ghoulification does is documented by experience rather than by clean scientific models. The transformation dramatically extends human lifespan. Ghouls can live for centuries, and the oldest of them have been present since the Great War itself. The ghoul from the television series, Cooper Howard, was ghoulified somewhere in the period following the Great War in 2077 and has been active in the wasteland for over 2 centuries by the show's timeline. Raul Tejeda, encountered in New Vegas, was alive before the Great War as a Mexican mechanic, survived the bombs as a ghoul, watched his family die across the intervening centuries, and eventually became a wasteland wanderer carrying the accumulated weight of 200 years of loss. This kind of longevity is extraordinary, and it comes at a price that different ghouls carry differently. The physical transformation produces the characteristic damaged skin appearance necrosis visible in the tissue, the distinctive facial features of someone whose biology has been fundamentally reorganized by radiation. The psychological implications of watching everyone you knew die while you continue watching generations of people live and end while you go on, watching the world change around you in ways that are sometimes catastrophic and sometimes simply strange, are not uniform. Some ghouls process this gracefully, or as gracefully as such a thing can be processed. Others are broken by it in ways that are hard to look at directly. The Memory Den in Good Neighbor, the establishment run by a woman named Irma, where clients can pay to re-experience their own memories through a machine, has a specific significance for the ghoul community in the Commonwealth. Those who were alive before the Great War can use the machine to revisit their pre-war lives, can experience moments from a world that no longer exists. For a ghoul who has been walking through the ruins of that world for 2 centuries, the question of whether this is healing or simply a more elaborate form of grief is not one the game resolves. It presents the service and lets you decide what you think of it. Underworld, in the Capital Wasteland, is the most significant ghoul community shown in Fallout 3. It exists inside the Museum of History, which is darkly appropriate. The ghouls have made their home inside a building dedicated to the documentation of the past, and many of them are themselves direct relics of the past. The community there has shops and services and a functioning social structure, and it has also a persistent awareness of its precariousness. The world outside Underworld is hostile to ghouls in ways that range from active violence to simple exclusion. The Brotherhood of Steel kills ghouls on sight, a policy that doesn't distinguish between feral and non-feral, because from the Brotherhood's perspective, the distinction is an inconvenience. Human settlements frequently refuse entry. The Mojave's New Vegas Strip bars ghouls from entry unless they have special permissions. The Tenpenny Tower questline in Fallout 3 is one of the more carefully constructed moral examinations in the series, precisely because it refuses to give you a comfortable answer. Roy Phillips and a group of ghouls want to be allowed into Tenpenny Tower, the luxury high-rise community that dominates the landscape near Megaton. The tower's residents don't want ghouls. Roy's methods escalate toward violence when polite requests fail. You can broker a deal, negotiate the integration of the ghouls into the tower's community, with the residents, under various degrees of pressure, agreeing to coexist. This seems like the good outcome, the peaceful outcome, the one that demonstrates that humans and ghouls can share space if the right conditions are created. Except that returning to Tenpenny Tower sometime later reveals that Roy Phillips and the ghouls have killed all the human residents. The integration didn't hold. Whatever the internal dynamics of that community produced after the lone wanderer brokered the deal and moved on, they produced a massacre. The ghoul position is understandable years of violence and exclusion, a moment of coexistence that was entered into under duress by people who hadn't genuinely changed their minds. The outcome is horrifying regardless of the understandability of the path that led there. The Fallout series doesn't let the Tenpenny Tower story become a simple lesson about integration being the right answer. It shows integration attempted and failed in a specific community under specific conditions, and it leaves you with that failure without reassurance that it would have gone differently with better implementation. Sometimes it does go differently. Sometimes the coexistence works. The Wasteland is not a controlled environment. Diamond City's Night of the Broken Mask is the example of what happens to coexistence when it breaks down in a specific and particularly damaging way. Diamond City had ghouls living in the community from its founding in the 2130 seconds until approximately 2282, a period of 150 years during which humans and ghouls shared space in the settlement built inside the ruins of Fenway Park. Then McDonough ran for mayor on a platform of expulsion and won, and the ghouls were thrown out. Families who had lived in Diamond City for generations, who had been there since before the parents of their current neighbors were born, were removed at gunpoint into the ruins outside the walls. The McDonough who becomes mayor is strongly suspected throughout the game of being a synth replacement, which adds a particular irony to the story. The man who expelled Diamond City's ghouls on a platform of protecting humanity may himself not be human. Whether this is true is something the game doesn't fully confirm, presenting it instead as something Diamond City's residents suspect without proof, which is its own kind of comment on what suspicion does to a community. John Hancock, born John McDonough, younger brother of the man who became Diamond City's mayor, took a different path. He grew up watching his brother's politics, watching the expulsion of the ghouls, watching what it meant for the city. He left Diamond City and ended up in Goodneighbor, in the community that had formed partly from the expelled ghouls and other outcasts. And at some point, out of a combination of disillusionment and something that reads like genuine searching, he obtained an experimental chem that would trigger ghoulification and took it deliberately. This is one of the stranger acts of self-reinvention in the series. Hancock chose to become a ghoul. He made it happen intentionally, and the motivation as he explains it across companion dialogue was to become something other than what he had been, to change his relationship to the world he'd been born into, to put himself on the other side of a dividing line that he had watched his family use as a weapon. He took a historical name from the American Revolution and built a new identity on it, and then took over Goodneighbor by removing the warlord who was running it badly, and has been the town's de facto leader since. Hancock's governance philosophy is essentially libertarian in the truest sense. You do what you want in Goodneighbor, and everyone has the right to be here, and violence against residents will be dealt with harshly, and the settlement does not import Diamond City's or anyone else's categories for who counts as a person. The thing that distinguishes Goodneighbor from chaos is Hancock's willingness to enforce this set of principles with personal force, and the loyalty it generates is genuine. The feralization question follows every long-lived ghoul like a shadow. At some point, the higher brain functions that allow a ghoul to maintain their personality and rationality begin to degrade. The precise mechanism is not fully understood, but prolonged radiation exposure, psychological trauma, and extended isolation all appear to accelerate the process. The terrifying thing about feralization is its unpredictability. Two ghouls exposed to identical conditions might have dramatically different outcomes. There is no reliable test. There is no way to know in advance whether you are someone who will retain yourself for centuries or someone who will lose themselves within decades. Some ghouls have chosen to preempt this possibility. Some have chosen to die before the degradation begins, rather than become something that would harm people they care about. This choice is documented in scattered logs and in companion dialogue, and it lands with a particular weight because it's a choice made not from despair but from something that looks very much like love. The Chinese remnants, a group of Chinese operatives who were stranded in America when the Great War ended and who ghoulified over time, sequestered themselves in the Mama Dulce's food processing facility near the capital, Wasteland's Georgetown. They maintained their military structure and their identities for over 2 centuries, communicating in Mandarin, cut off from a homeland that might not exist anymore, waiting for orders that were never going to come. When the lone wanderer encounters them, they attack. But the logs in the facility document the early decades of their isolation, the initial certainty that contact would be reestablished, the gradual shift to uncertainty, the long accommodation to a permanence they had not initially accepted. Glowing ones represent a specific and extreme end of the ghoul spectrum. Individuals whose radiation exposure has been so intense and so prolonged that they have become themselves radioactive, emitting harmful radiation at significant levels, capable of recharging and healing other ghouls through this emission. The mechanics of this are deeply strange biologically, and the lore doesn't fully explain how a human body becomes a walking radiation emitter at lethal levels. What's notable is that glowing ones are not always feral. There are documented cases of glowing ones who retain their personality and cognitive function, who choose to use their radiation emission capacity for the benefit of other ghouls rather than as a weapon. Glowing Herald, encountered in certain locations, is an example of someone who can harm humans through proximity who has chosen isolation specifically to avoid doing so. The Chinese submarine captain Zhao, who we discussed in the Commonwealth section, represents ghouls at their most poignant. Someone who has survived everything, who has not gone feral, who carries the full weight of everything they've done and everything they've lost, and who has one remaining wish in a world that has moved so far past the context of that wish that there's no meaningful way to pursue it. He wants to go home. He was 50 years old, approximately, when the bombs fell. He is now more than 250. Everyone he knew died a very long time ago. The country he served may or may not exist. The Fallout TV series expanded the ghoul mythology in ways that the games had left somewhat abstract by making Cooper Howard a protagonist whose ghoulification happened within the narrative's frame of reference. Watching a character navigate the transition from the confident pre-war actor to the centuries-old wasteland hunter gives a concreteness to what ghoulification means that log entries and companion dialogue could only approximate. The detail that ghouls can apparently suppress their feralization through specific means through the regular use of certain chems, through maintaining purpose and identity, adds a layer to the mythology that reframes the feralization question slightly. It suggests that keeping yourself is work, that the maintenance of personhood in a ghoul requires sustained effort in ways that human personhood doesn't, and that the ghouls who succeed in remaining themselves across centuries are not simply lucky but actively choosing, over and over, to remain. Section 5. Creatures born from forgotten science. The wasteland is full of things that should not exist, and most of them have a history. The creatures that roam the irradiated landscapes of Fallout's world are not simply the product of 2 centuries of radiation exposure, though radiation has certainly done its work. Many of them are the direct consequence of research programs that were running before the bombs fell, experiments in genetic modification and biological weaponry that escaped their containers or were released deliberately or mutated beyond their intended parameters in the chaos following the Great War. Understanding where the creatures came from is, in some ways, understanding the pre-war world's relationship to its own power more clearly than any political history can provide. The same impulse that produced the Vault experiments and the FEV research and the Enclave's plans for civilizational cleanup, the belief that science could and should be deployed without constraint when national security or competitive advantage was at stake produced the Deathclaw. The Deathclaw's origins are documented in Fallout 2's strategy guide and referenced in scattered terminal entries across the series. The creature was a military bioweapon, engineered by the United States government as a cheap replacement for human soldiers in high-risk combat environments. The genetic base was the Jackson's chameleon, a relatively small reptile selected for its natural camouflage ability, which was deemed a useful starting characteristic for an organism intended to operate in hostile terrain. From there, the genetic engineering program added everything else. The dramatically increased size, the reinforced bone structure, the 5-fingered hands with their curved claws designed specifically for rending, the extraordinarily fast movement, the heightened aggression. The result was an apex predator constructed from scratch, optimized for killing, then fitted with a control collar and sent into situations the army had decided were too expensive to risk human lives on. The control systems apparently worked, up to a point. Deathclaws were deployed, Deathclaws were effective, and then the bombs fell, and the control infrastructure went dark, and the collars came off literally and figuratively, and the engineered predators began to do what they had been designed to do, except for themselves rather than for a military that no longer existed. Within a few generations, free-range Deathclaws had developed into one of the wasteland's most dangerous creatures. The genetic programming for aggression and predation, combined with the radical environmental pressures of the irradiated wasteland, produced animals that were significantly more capable than their original designs, faster, harder to kill, more intelligent in a context-specific way that made them effective hunters of everything, including armed human beings. The Enclave, during their research period in the 2,240 seconds, captured some of these feral Deathclaws and ran a separate experimental track, FEV injection, to elevate their intelligence. The results exceeded the experiment's parameters. The Deathclaws exposed to this treatment developed fully human-level intelligence, in some cases exceeding it. A pack led by a Deathclaw named Gruthar established themselves in Vault 13, coexisting peacefully with a human population, having arrived at a philosophical position isolationist, pacifist, committed to avoiding conflict wherever possible, through what appears to be genuine rational reflection. Gruthar had real regret about the killings he had carried out while under Enclave control. He understood what he had done, could articulate why it was wrong, and had built a community partly as a form of atonement. The Chosen One can encounter this community in Fallout 2, and it is genuinely moving in ways that are easy to miss if you're moving quickly through the game. An engineered predator, built by a government as a disposable tool, had become something that could grieve. The ghoul presents a different kind of origin story, not designed, but transformed. Ghouls are human beings who received radiation exposure at levels sufficient to trigger a kind of biological adaptation rather than simply killing them. The process is poorly understood even within the lore. Not everyone exposed to equivalent radiation becomes a ghoul, and the factors that determine whether the exposure produces ghouls, super mutants through FEV, or simply death are not fully catalogued. What the ghoul transition produces is extraordinary longevity. Ghouls can survive for centuries alongside progressive physical decay, and, in some cases, the eventual loss of higher cognitive function, which is what differentiates a feral ghoul from one who has retained their personality and reasoning ability. The question of when and whether a ghoul goes feral is one of the series' most quietly melancholy threads. Feral ghouls are hostile. They attack on sight. They appear to have lost whatever made them individuals. But the line between a thinking, speaking, feeling ghoul and a feral one is not always clear in the lore. It seems to be a gradual degradation rather than a sharp transition, and the factors that accelerate or slow it are uncertain. Some ghouls have been self-aware for over 200 years. The ghoul in the television series Cooper Howard became ghoulified around the time of the Great War and retained his personality and memories through the full span of the post-war period. Other ghouls seem to lose themselves within decades. Roy Phillips, a ghoul character encountered in Fallout 3, has been living in a drainage chamber outside Tenpenny Tower for what appears to be years, wanting nothing more than to be admitted to the luxury community inside the building. His anger is coherent and his grievance is real. The arc of the quest associated with him leads to an outcome that, regardless of how you navigate it, is profoundly sad in the way that situations built on irreconcilable needs tend to be. Harold represents something even more unusual. Harold is a human being who was exposed to FEV in the Mariposa military base during the early post-war period and mutated in a way that was significantly different from the standard super mutant transformation he retained his human size and appearance and consciousness, but developed a plant growing from his head. The plant, which Harold named Bob, grew over the following decades. By the time of Fallout 3, Harold had become a tree. He was still alive, still conscious, still capable of conversation, rooted in place in the center of Oasis, a secret community in the capital wasteland that had formed around the extraordinary ecosystem his expanding growth had produced. Harold wanted to die. He had been alive for a very long time, in increasing pain, unable to move, watching things grow around him that he hadn't asked to grow. His request that the lone wanderer help him end his existence is presented as a genuine moral question. Do you honor what someone wants for themselves, or do you prioritize the ecosystem that's developed around them and the community that depends on it? There's no clean answer. The community in Oasis needs him. He is suffering. Both of these things are true. The centaur is a creature that results from FEV exposure to a multi-species mixture, producing something that combines anatomical elements from several organisms in a deeply unstable configuration. The centaur is not a successful organism by any meaningful standard. It's functional in the sense of being mobile and aggressive, but it appears to be in constant physiological distress, and whatever cognitive capability it has retained is minimal. It serves as an attendant animal for super mutant groups, possibly because its aggression is reliable and its needs are minimal, possibly because super mutants have some kind of bond with FEV-related creatures that operates below the level of articulate thought. The super mutants themselves have multiple distinct populations with different origins. The West Coast super mutants originated with the Masters program, using FEV from the Mariposa military base. They tend toward gray-green coloration and variable intelligence. Some retain considerable reasoning capacity, while others are almost entirely driven by aggression. The East Coast super mutants originated with Vault-87's experimental program, using a different FEV strain, and they tend toward green-yellow coloration and are generally less intelligent than their West Coast counterparts, with some exceptions. The Appalachian supermutants emerged from Vault-Tec facility contamination of the local water supply, representing an accidental release rather than a controlled experiment. The Institute's supermutants in the Commonwealth emerged from a program in the Bioscience Division that was ultimately deemed unsuccessful and discontinued, but which had already produced a population of mutated humans living in the ruins above the Institute's underground campus. The rad scorpion is one of the wasteland's most widespread creatures, descended from bark scorpions that were already large by pre-war standards and that adapted to post-war radiation by growing dramatically larger and developing reinforced carapaces. The process was apparently straightforward biological adaptation rather than deliberate genetic engineering, though some of the more extreme rad scorpion variants suggest that radiation exposure has been doing extraordinary and somewhat unpredictable things to the scorpion's developmental biology over multiple generations. The Mirelurk lineages trace back to horseshoe crabs and other crustaceans, and the transformation those species underwent under post-war radioactive conditions is one of the more dramatic examples of rapid evolutionary adaptation documented in the series. The various Mirelurk types, the standard kings, the kings with their distinctive humanoid silhouettes, the hunters with their more crab-like body plan, seem to represent genuinely distinct evolutionary branches that emerged from similar starting material under different environmental conditions. The fact that Mirelurk eggs are considered a delicacy in some wasteland communities is one of those small details that tells you a lot about what 2 centuries of food scarcity does to dietary standards. Section 6. The Lone Wanderer's Unseen World. Fallout 3's capital wasteland is Washington, D.C., comprehensively destroyed, and it is full of things you were never supposed to find. The Dunwich building sits northeast of the city, not far from the coast, and it has no quest attached to it in the base game. It's just a location, marked on no map until you stumble across it, and the only reason to go inside is curiosity. That curiosity is immediately rewarded with something that doesn't feel like the rest of the game. Objects fall off shelves without anyone touching them. Doors open on their own. As you descend through the building's levels, you begin experiencing hallucinations, fragmented visions that don't connect cleanly to anything else in the lore, images of pre-war rituals, figures standing in arrangements that suggest ceremony rather than ordinary life. At the very bottom of the building, submerged underwater, there is an altar. The altar bears the name Ugg-Qualtoth. This name connects to a thread that runs through multiple games across multiple locations. In the Point Lookout DLC, there is a cult with deep roots, a book called the Kriv Bekni that functions as their central text, and a questline that leads back to the Dunwich building on the mainland. Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 returns to a quarry owned by the same corporation, Dunwich Borers LLC, and the same pattern of strange hallucinations, ritual artifacts, and descending horror is present there too. Employee logs describe miners experiencing increasingly disturbing phenomena as they dig deeper. The Dunwich thread is a deliberate Lovecraftian construction, and the games have been consistently coy about how literally they intend it to be read. The name Ugg-Qualtoth is itself a reference. It evokes the sound of Lovecraft's cosmological entities without directly naming any of them, suggesting the presence of something ancient and incomprehensible without fully committing to it as a statement of fact about the world. The Fallout universe is, at its core, a science fiction universe. Everything strange can in principle be explained through radiation, or FEV, or experimental technology that went wrong. But the Dunwich material resists clean scientific explanation in ways that several other mystery threads don't. The mysterious stranger has been present in every Fallout game since the first one. He appears as a perk, a mechanical system. If you invest in the mysterious stranger perk, there is a random chance during combat that a man in a fedora and trench coat will materialize beside you, deliver a killing shot with a unique .44 Magnum, and vanish before you can interact with him. He is not acknowledged by most characters. He leaves no trace. He has been doing this, helping various protagonists survive specific dangerous moments across a span of time that would require him to be extraordinarily long-lived, or to not be aging, or to be something other than a man in a hat who helps people. The most substantial clue about his nature in the series comes from Fallout New Vegas, where a character called the Lonesome Drifter, found in the Mojave Desert, mentions his father was a mysterious figure and carries the same model of weapon, which plays the same musical sting when drawn. The lonesome drifter's father was apparently the mysterious stranger. The mysterious stranger has a son, who grew up in the wasteland without him, who inherited a specific handgun. The stranger has been absent, and has apparently been absent long enough for this child to grow into an adult. Nick Valentine, in Fallout 4, has a full dossier on the mysterious stranger in his office. He reacts with visible shock the first time the stranger appears while Nick is accompanying the sole survivor, as if he has been trying to catch a glimpse for a long time. Nick's notes describe the stranger's activity across the capital wasteland and the Commonwealth with the kind of detail that suggests sustained, serious investigation by a man who is also a synthetic detective, carrying the memories of someone who died decades before the Great War. What is the mysterious stranger? The theories range from time traveler to synth to some form of guardian entity that exists outside the normal rules of the Fallout universe. The games don't answer this. They add clues carefully and consistently, always in directions that expand the mystery rather than resolve it, which suggests the mystery is intentional, a thread kept deliberately loose to let each player's imagination do work that an explanation would foreclose. The Cabot family in Fallout 4 represents a different kind of hidden history. Jack Cabot is a scientist in the Commonwealth who approaches the sole survivor with an unusual problem. His father, Lorenzo, is locked in the basement of an old asylum and has been locked there for a very long time. The questline that follows reveals that the Cabots have been alive since the late 1800s, sustained by a serum derived from an alien artifact Lorenzo discovered during an archaeological expedition in the Middle East in 1894. Lorenzo himself, who encountered the artifact directly, has been driven into a state that's somewhere between genuine madness and something that might be described differently if his mental state hadn't been compromised by 200 years of captivity. The alien artifact's nature is never fully explained. Its effects on human longevity are documented. The Cabot family has the evidence of their own survival. The specifics of how it works, what it actually is, and what relationship Lorenzo's condition has to its properties remain deliberately opaque. The questline ends with a choice about what to do with Lorenzo, and neither option provides full clarity about what was happening or what it meant. Parsons State Insane Asylum, where Lorenzo is being held, has its own history worth noting. It's one of the locations in the Commonwealth that was functioning as a facility in the pre-war period, housing patients with genuine mental illness alongside whoever the government decided needed to be institutionalized and removed from circulation. The records suggest the distinction between these two categories was not always carefully maintained. Vault 114 in Boston has an experiment that sits at the more psychological end of the Vault-Tec spectrum. It was marketed exclusively to the wealthy executives, politicians, the upper strata of pre-war society as a premium facility. The reality was that it had been designed to confine its wealthy residents in conditions far below what they were accustomed to, with an overseer specifically selected from the working class with instructions to impose his own preferences on the population. The experiment was examining the psychological effects of economic displacement on people who had never experienced it, and asking how long those effects would last before the residents either adapted or broke down. The vault was never completed. The bombs fell before the experiment could run. But the overseer, Nick Triggerman, was already in place, and the wealthy residents who had managed to reach the vault in time were already inside. What happened in those hours between the door sealing and whatever ended the vault's functioning is the kind of gap the game leaves for your imagination to fill. The Chinese submarine Yangtze, resting partially submerged in Boston Harbor, carries its own extraordinary story. The submarine had been positioned in the harbor as part of the Sino-American War, tasked with launching warheads. Its captain, Zhao, fired all but one of the submarine's missiles on the 23rd of October, 2077. The one that didn't fire stayed armed in its tube due to a malfunction. Zhao is still there, 2 centuries later. A ghoul, still in command of a vessel that no longer has a crew, still carrying the weight of what he did on that morning, still tending to a submarine that has become something between a home and a monument to a moment he can't put down. He wants to return to China. He doesn't know if China still exists. He has been waiting for 200 years. And the waiting has its own quality that the game renders in the specific way of Fallout's best character writing quietly. In dialogue that reveals more than it states, in the gaps between what someone says and what they mean. Point Lookout, a DLC set on a Maryland island, contains one of the series' more genuinely strange environments, a wetland community that has developed in near-total isolation from the capital wasteland, producing a culture and a set of social arrangements that are distinctively different from what you find on the mainland. The tribals of Point Lookout have preserved pieces of pre-war culture in distorted forms, combined with the cult practices left by the Ugqualtoth worshippers, and with whatever adaptations 2 centuries of isolated survival required. The Brains in Big Town, a settlement north of the capital wasteland, represent one of the more quietly heartbreaking environmental stories in Fallout 3. Little Lamplight, a children's community, sends its residents out when they turn 16. Big Town is where those teenagers end up. The settlement is perpetually struggling, perpetually short on people who know how to do anything, perpetually endangered by super mutants and other threats, because its residents were children until recently, and children who grow up in a children's community don't necessarily get taught the skills required for adult survival. The knowledge transfer that should happen across generations in a normal society keeps getting interrupted. Section 7. New Vegas. The city that shouldn't exist. Las Vegas shouldn't be there. That's the first thing to understand about New Vegas as a place in the Fallout universe. When 77 atomic warheads targeted the city and its surrounding region on the 23rd of October, 2077, Robert House's elaborate defensive preparations managed to neutralize 59 of them through networked computing systems that predicted trajectories and force-transmitted disarm codes. Another 9 were destroyed by the laser cannons installed on the roof of the Lucky 38. The remaining 9 hit the surrounding area but not the city proper. The result was that Las Vegas, its casinos and its towers, and its extraordinary concentration of pre-war infrastructure survived the Great War with relatively minor damage, compared to anywhere else in America. Compared to Washington, which was a ruin of collapsed monuments and flooded streets, or Boston, which was a radiation-heavy wreck of collapsed buildings, New Vegas was almost pristine. Its neon lights didn't work, and its systems were dark, and the desert around it was home to the chaotic aftermath of civilizational collapse. But the buildings were standing. House himself was not fully conscious for most of the intervening period. His defensive systems had suffered from running on the inferior Mark I operating software. The Platinum chip with the Mark II upgrade had arrived 1 day late, and the strain of managing the warhead intercepts had crashed his systems into a decades-long dormancy. He didn't fully reactivate until 2138, at which point he emerged into a world that had been doing whatever it did for 60 years without him, and began working on the problem of how to turn what remained of Las Vegas into something that could function as the foundation for a new civilization. The approach he settled on tells you a great deal about House's worldview. He found 3 tribal groups that had emerged in the area, the Omertas, the White Glove Society, and the Chairmen, and made them offers. Resources from the Lucky 38 stockpiles, tools, supplies, skills. In exchange, they would transform themselves, adopt new identities, present as the staffs and proprietors of the 3 primary casinos on the Strip, behave according to the specific social codes that House defined for them. They would be the visible face of New Vegas, the working mechanism of the city's economy, the people who made it run. In exchange for this, they would have protection and resources, and a place in whatever House was building. This arrangement is fascinating and deeply strange. House needed people who would accept specific constraints on their behavior and present specific faces to the outside world, and he got them by making an exchange that felt like a good deal from the perspective of the tribal groups involved. They became something. They had standing and purpose and, to a degree, identity. The cost was that the identity had been assigned to them, not developed, and the standing was contingent on continued compliance with House's vision. The Omertas developed their own culture around crime and vice, and maintained the Gomorrah Casino as a place of deliberate moral ambiguity. They resented House's authority more openly than the other families, and had, by the time of New Vegas's story, made arrangements with Caesar's Legion that House would have found unacceptable had he known. The White Glove Society developed elaborate rituals around high-end dining and exclusive social access at the Ultra-Luxe Casino, and had also developed, at some point in their history, a preference for including human meat in their menus. a detail the game presents with a studied restraint that makes it more disturbing than graphic treatment would. The chairman ran the Tops Casino and built their identity around 1950s. Cool, the aesthetic language of Rat Pack Las Vegas, all fedoras and lounge suits and polished surfaces. Benny, the chairman's leader, is the game's opening antagonist, the man who shot the courier and took the platinum chip, and his ambition is to replace House with Yes Man, an AI he has reprogrammed to do whatever he says and use the Lucky 38's infrastructure to take control of New Vegas for himself. The platinum chip's importance is layered. On the surface, it's a data storage device that contains the Mark II software upgrade for House's Securitron army. The Securitrons that police the Strip are a visible fraction of the total number manufactured in army sealed beneath the Lucky 38's foundations, waiting. The chip would upgrade their combat capabilities dramatically, turning a police force into a military power capable of taking and holding territory well beyond the Strip. But the chip also represents something House couldn't plan around, the timing of its delivery. He ordered it in the final days before the Great War, designed it himself, had it manufactured at a facility in Sunnyvale that was destroyed before delivery could be completed. The chip wandered through post-war history for over 2 centuries before being rediscovered and assigned to the courier for delivery. Everything about the Battle of Hoover Dam, everything about House's attempt to make New Vegas an independent wasteland power, rests on this device that should have arrived on the 22nd of October, 2077, and didn't. The NCR's interest in Hoover Dam is genuinely understandable from a resource perspective. The dam still generates power, which means it has the capacity to supply electrical energy to a growing post-war civilization at a scale nothing else can match. The NCR is the most functional, large-scale political organization in the West at the time of New Vegas's story, a democratic republic descended from the founding of Shady Sands, with elections and a Congress and a president, with standing military and trade relationships, and something approximating the rule of law across a substantial territory. Its ambitions in the Mojave are territorial and economic, but not nihilistic. Caesar's Legion represents something philosophically distinct. Not a failed pre-war institution or a new post-war democracy, but a deliberate construction of a specific ideology. Edward Sallow, who became Caesar, was a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse who encountered a tribal confederation in the Arizona region and began applying his knowledge of historical Roman military organization to build a unified military power from the disparate tribes. His methods were brutal and systematic. He was genuinely applying a historical model, genuinely believed in the project, and had produced a military force that was genuinely effective. The Legion's effectiveness and its methods are inseparable from each other in a way that the game takes seriously. The territories under Legion control have very low levels of violent crime, reliable trade routes, effective military policing. They are also run by a system that maintains these qualities through enslavement, through sexual violence treated as an institutional feature, through the systematic destruction of any social structure that might provide an alternative center of loyalty to the Legion itself. The game doesn't let you forget either side of this. The ending of New Vegas is unique in the Fallout series precisely because it doesn't have a canonical resolution. Every major Fallout game ends with an implied best outcome. There may be tragedy or ambiguity along the way, but a right answer emerges. New Vegas was designed to resist this. The NCR ending, the House ending, the Legion ending, the Wildcard Independence ending, each was given genuine ideological weight, genuine arguments for its merits and genuine costs, and the game's creators at Obsidian have consistently declined to declare one canonical. The story belongs to the courier in a way that Bethesda's games, for all their strengths, haven't quite replicated. Mr. New Vegas. The radio DJ of New Vegas Radio is a small mystery that sits in the background of the game, easily overlooked. He was created before the Great War, an AI designed to entertain radio listeners, and he has been doing this continuously since then, uninterrupted by the 2 centuries of chaos that passed above his antenna. He gives weather forecasts. He makes cheerful remarks about the Mojave. He introduces songs. His connection to House is implied. There's no apparent explanation for a pre-war AI maintaining a functioning radio station through the post-war period without some kind of support structure, and House is the only entity in the area capable of providing one. But House has never taken credit for Mr. New Vegas, and Mr. New Vegas has never discussed House on air. Whatever the relationship is, it's been maintained in silence. The Vault 11 survivors, specifically the possibility that one of them walked out and continued living, is a thread that the game files acknowledge and the narrative doesn't follow up on. Somewhere in the Mojave, or somewhere beyond it, a person who was the last one alive in Vault 11 was wandering. They had just been told that every sacrifice made in that vault had been unnecessary. They had watched 4 of their companions take their own lives in response to this information. They had been alone since then. What do you do with that? What do you do with knowing what you know about what happened in that vault, and living in a world that doesn't know and doesn't care, that has its own catastrophes to process? The game doesn't answer this. Maybe the Mojave has an answer somewhere that just hasn't been found yet. Section 8. The Commonwealth's Buried Histories. The city of Boston is recognizable under the rubble, and that recognition is part of what makes it strange. You can see the Old North Church, where the railroad's headquarters hides. You can see Bunker Hill, still standing, still visible from a significant distance, now a trade hub controlled by the gunners rather than a revolutionary monument. The Freedom Trail runs through the city as a literal path you follow, red brick set in the ground, leading to the railroad's front door if you know the cipher. The physical geography of pre-war Boston persists in the Commonwealth in ways that Washington's rubble-obscured geography doesn't quite manage. The story of University Point is one of those Commonwealth histories that you can piece together entirely through environmental investigation if you take the time, and it rewards the effort. The settlement that existed there before the Institute destroyed it had its own governance structure, its own social dynamics, its own records of daily life and political argument. The terminals in Sedgwick Hall document the community's discovery of a pre-war artifact cache beneath the settlement, and the council's debate about what to do with the discovery. One faction wanted to keep the find quiet and leverage it carefully. Another wanted to trade the knowledge to the Institute, reasoning that the Institute would eventually find out anyway and it was better to benefit from the transaction than to resist it. This debate was apparently still ongoing when the Institute's synths arrived. The synths cleared the settlement efficiently. The terminal stopped recording. What's left now is the environmental storytelling of a community that was alive in the weeks before its end, arguing about something that turned out not to matter at all. The Yangtze is moored in the harbor, and Captain Zhao has been waiting. His story is worth telling in full because it represents something the Commonwealth offers that the capital wasteland's more visible histories don't. The experience of a person from the other side of the war, a Chinese military officer who did his duty and has been living with it ever since. Zhao is not villainous. He is not even particularly conflicted in the way that might be expected. He is simply old and sad and very tired, and he wants to go home to a country that may not exist. His relationship to what he did on the 23rd of October 2077 is carried without drama. He fired the missiles because that was his mission, and the world ended anyway, and he has been in this harbor for a very long time. The submarine is deteriorating around him. The reactor is barely functional. He asks the sole survivor to find a new guidance chip that will allow the Yangtze to move again, and offers the submarine's last torpedo in exchange. Whether China survived the Great War is genuinely unknown in the lore. There are scattered references to the possibility some terminal entries suggest there might be functioning communities somewhere in Asia, but nothing confirmed. The world the Fallout games show is almost exclusively American. What the nuclear exchange looked like from the other side, what survived, what those survivors built over the subsequent 2 centuries, these are questions the series has left open. Diamond City is built inside Fenway Park, and the game handles this detail with characteristic lightness. You don't fully realize what you're walking into until you notice the shape of the walls around the settlement. The green monster's distinctive outline is recognizable once you've seen it. The park's seating terraces have become the housing of the city's wealthiest residents, looking down on the market district in the exact position that spectators once occupied, looking down at the playing field. The political history of Diamond City includes a moment called the Night of the Broken Mask, the discovery, years before the game's story, that several members of the community were synths. This discovery and the violent response to it produced a profound and lasting paranoia that shapes the settlement's culture in the present day. Mayor McDonough is widely suspected of being a synth. In a small, self-contained community where everyone knows everyone, The possibility that anyone might be a synthetic replacement for someone you loved is corrosive in a specific, intimate way. Nick Valentine's detective agency in Diamond City is one of the game's most quietly interesting narrative spaces. Nick is, by his own description, a second-generation synth with the full uploaded personality and memories of a pre-war detective named Nicholas Valentine. The original Valentine was working on a case involving a missing girl named Jenny and her mobster boyfriend Eddie Winter when the war ended. Nick the Synth was the result of a prototype memory upload experiment by the Institute, and when he escaped, he retained everything: the skills, the grief, the unfinished case. Finding and confronting Eddie Winter, who had survived the war as a ghoul through a radiation serum he'd been developing, represents the resolution of a case that began before the bombs fell and can only be closed more than 2 centuries later. The irony of Nick's situation, a man who died before the war, whose memories and personality were mapped into a synthetic body without his consent, who woke up as something genuinely new, gives him a perspective on the question of synth personhood that's different from any other characters. He didn't ask to be a synth. He didn't choose to have his identity transferred. He just woke up like this, with someone else's lifetime of memories and no original memories of his own, and he made something of it. Concord and Sanctuary Hills represent the game's starting geography, and the environmental storytelling there is exceptionally dense. The houses around Sanctuary Hills each have small stories, the weapons magazines and survival notes left behind, the specific configurations of furniture that suggest specific moments of panic or preparation, the skeleton arrangements that tell you what people were doing when the bombs fell. One house has a skeleton face down in the kitchen, another has a pair of skeletons arranged side by side on a bed. These are the kinds of details that accumulate slowly into an image of what the 23rd of October 2077 felt like from the inside of a neighborhood in suburban Massachusetts. Good Neighbor, the settlement that exists outside Diamond City's gates and beyond its rules, has a creation story. It was founded by a group of ghouls and other outcasts who were expelled from Diamond City during the Night of the Broken Mask and its aftermath, who settled in the old Scala Square area and built something that operated on different principles. No exclusions based on appearance. Criminality tolerated to a degree not possible inside Diamond City. Protection available to those who paid for it. The settlement functions on Good Neighbor's own terms, enforced by the charismatic ghoul John Hancock, a name he took from a historical figure, one of those small acts of wasteland culture creation that appear throughout the series. The castle, former headquarters of the Minutemen, sits on an island fortress that was historically Castle Island in Boston Harbor. The Minutemen were driven from it years before the game's story by a creature called the Mirelurk Queen, and their subsequent collapse as an organization is one of the Commonwealth's most significant political histories. The Minutemen were the closest thing the Commonwealth had to a civic defense organization, a volunteer militia committed to protecting settlements against threats. The individual settlements couldn't handle themselves. Their collapse left a power vacuum that was filled poorly and incompletely by self-interest and isolation. Preston Garvey, one of the last surviving Minutemen at the game's beginning, carries the weight of watching that collapse from the inside. He's been leading a small refugee group from Quincy, where the Minutemen made their last stand against the Gunners, and his faith in the organization's revival is genuine but fragile in the way that faith in something you've watched fail tends to be. The College Square area of the Commonwealth contains a remarkable piece of pre-war storytelling. The terminals of a professor who was observing his students and colleagues as the world ended, writing entries that shift gradually from academic detachment to something closer to raw documentation of horror. His last entry describes looking out a window at what the world had become and understanding that there was no returning from it. The Jamaica Plain community had been accumulating rumors for years. By the time of the game's present day, people spoke of an extraordinary treasure hidden somewhere in the area, enough to change someone's life in the wasteland's economic terms. The reality of Jamaica Plain, when you reach it, is ghouls and traps set by people who came before looking for the treasure. The treasure itself, when found, is a display of pre-war Americana flags, a Grognak the Barbarian comic, a signed baseball, a ceremonial chest carrying items that would have been priceless to a pre-war American and are of questionable practical value to someone surviving in the ruins. The joke is that the treasure is real, and it's real in the terms of the world that no longer exists. and the word treasure carried over into the New World without its meaning following. The mass fusion building, despite its corporate origins, contains a history of its own internal dynamics, research teams working under impossible pressure, safety concerns being dismissed in the name of competitive advantage, the specific quality of pre-war corporate culture that treated its employees as human resources in the most literal sense of the term. The terminal entries there document a company that was doing genuinely important work in fusion energy research and was also failing the people doing that work in consistent, systematic ways that neither the management nor the workers had the framework to fully name. Section 8b. The stories the wasteland keeps. There is a category of Fallout storytelling that operates entirely without quests, without objectives, without any mechanical incentive to engage with it. It exists in the environmental detail in the specific arrangement of objects in a room, in the skeletons posed in ways that tell you something about the moment of death, in the holotapes left by people who are long gone for an audience that was never going to come. The Everett Estate story in the Commonwealth is one of the examples players cite most often when talking about Fallout 4's environmental writing at its best. Wayne Tornquist and his family and neighbors in the months after the Great War, fortifying their neighborhood, trying to protect what they had. The holotapes from this period document cooperation and fear, and the particular texture of a community trying to maintain itself when all the support structures are gone. A neighbor was nearly killed when he went looking for duct tape at another house. Someone else shot the attacker from a rooftop across the street. If you go to that house, you find the skeleton face down near the duct tape and the window with a clear sightline to where the shooter would have stood. The physical evidence matches the story exactly. Lance's brother Leon betrays the settlement to raiders. The final entries record the coming of the raiders, the fall of the fortification, the end of the community, Wayne fleeing with his children. Whether they made it anywhere, whether the children survived, what happened to the people who weren't mentioned in the final entries, these things are not recorded. The story ends mid-sentence, because real stories do. The Dunwich Borer's location in the northeast corner of the Commonwealth builds on the mythology established in Fallout 3's Dunwich building without explaining it. The quarry was owned by the same company. The miners who work there kept logs that begin with normal workplace documentation, machinery, maintenance, production quotas, safety reports, and shift as they dig deeper into something that doesn't fit that framing. They hear things. They see things. They begin having dreams that follow them into waking hours. The deepest parts of the quarry contain evidence of ritual activity that predates the company's ownership by an indeterminate period, and at the very bottom, underwater, there is an altar with a familiar quality. The altar at the bottom of Dunwich Borers connects to the one in Fallout 3's Dunwich building, which connects to the cult in Point Lookout's DLC, which connects to the Lovecraftian mythology. The series has been threading through its lore since the third game. At no point does the series explicitly confirm that the supernatural elements implied by this thread are real in the game world's physical terms. At no point does it definitively deny it. The ambiguity is the point. The wasteland has space for things that don't resolve into clean explanations. The Federal Surveillance Center, K-21B, hidden in the glowing sea, requires significant effort to reach the glowing sea, is one of the most heavily irradiated areas of the Commonwealth, and the entrance to the surveillance center is not marked. Inside, Arlen Glass's logs tell the story of a government employee assigned to the facility with a small team just as the bombs fell. The team had been running communications monitoring operations, and the transition from "this is a temporary situation" to "this is permanent" is documented in Glass's entries with a bureaucratic fidelity that makes it more devastating than dramatic writing would have. Glass continues writing entries long after it's clear that no one is going to read them. He continues documenting because documentation was his job, and because it imposed structure on days that had stopped having natural structure, and because writing to an audience that isn't there is a form of insisting that an audience exists. The final entry is not dramatic, it's an inventory. The Sanctuary Hills neighborhood, the sole survivor's starting point, where the game begins in the final days before the Great War, contains its own layers of post-bomb story, in addition to the pre-war snapshot the introduction provides. The neighbors who didn't make it into Vault 111 in time are there, as feral ghouls 2 centuries later. The specific people who were Nate and Nora's neighbors, the people they went over for cookouts, The people whose children played with Sean are now the creatures attacking the settlement that some playthroughs turn their former homes into. This is not highlighted in any quest objective. It's simply there, visible if you're paying attention to the game's opening sequence and then returning to the area. The Wasteland's biography is written in corpses and creatures and holotapes, and the specific way that time passes over a place that used to be something else. Section 9b. The Followers and the Forgotten Factions. Not every organization in the Fallout universe is a military power or a political movement. Some of the most interesting factions are the ones built around different principles entirely. The Followers of the Apocalypse exist in the Fallout universe as something unusual, an organization committed to knowledge without militarism, to healing without territorial ambition, to the idea that the Wasteland's problems are fundamentally problems of information and health rather than problems of power. Founded in Southern California in the early post-war period, the Followers have been operating as healers, educators, and archivists for generations, moving through the Wasteland with minimal force, offering medical services and education in exchange for knowledge about what's out there. Their neutrality, their refusal to align with the major factions is both their strength and their consistent limitation. In New Vegas, they operate clinics in the Outer Vegas area and have members distributed across the Mojave. They want nothing to do with the factional conflict over Hoover Dam. They treat the wounded from all sides. This principled neutrality means they survive ideological transitions without being targeted, but it also means they can never control the outcome of those transitions, can never make the larger structural changes that would make their work less necessary. Dr. Arcade Gannon, one of New Vegas's companions, is a Followers member with a complicated personal history tied to the Enclave, a detail he keeps private and that reveals itself through companion quests if you spend enough time with him. His relationship to the Followers' principles is genuine, but also shaped by his awareness that his own existence is entangled with an organization whose ideology was the opposite of everything the Followers stand for. The tension between these things is never fully resolved in his personal arc, which is part of what makes him one of the series' more dimensionally realized characters. The New California Republic's founding story, traced through the background lore of multiple games, is a genuine example of post-apocalyptic political institution building that worked, or at least worked well enough to produce something recognizable as a functional state. Shady Sands was founded by survivors from Vault-15 in the year after the Great War, grew through the decades into a town and then a city, and eventually became the capital of a democratic republic that had elections and a Congress and something resembling a legal system. This took generations. It required the specific efforts of specific people, Aradesh, who founded it, his daughter Tandy, who led it for much of its formative period, the various figures who chose the Republic's values and wrote its institutions. Tandy's leadership in particular is interesting in the lore. She was Shady Sands' most significant political figure, the president, for an extraordinarily long time, governing with a combination of genuine democratic legitimacy and practical authority that produced a relatively stable state. Her policies extended legal protection to ghouls and other mutated individuals, which was controversial within the NCR's constituent communities, but represented a principled position about what the Republic was for. The NCR's arc from principled founding to the resource-hungry, sometimes violent empire that it is in New Vegas, stretching itself thin across the Mojave, is the arc of an institution whose founding principles outlasted their ability to be fully operationalized. The Followers of the Apocalypse and the NCR have a complicated relationship in the New Vegas lore, precisely because the Followers' neutrality makes them simultaneously valuable to the NCR as medical support in territory they control, and frustrating as an organization that refuses to subordinate its mission to NCR political objectives. The game's factions all have relationships to each other that are shaped by history rather than just ideology, and the Followers' history with the NCR is one of those long-running practical relationships in which principles have been negotiated and compromised in specific ways over specific events. Caesar's Legion, despite being the game's most straightforwardly oppressive faction, has an intellectual founder whose ideas deserve attention. Edward Sallow Caesar was a Followers member before he became the dictator of the Legion, and his knowledge of history is genuine and extensive. He has read the primary sources on Rome. He understands, or believes he understands, why Rome worked as a political and military unit for as long as it did. His argument is that the post-war wasteland needs a degree of enforced order that democratic institutions can't produce quickly enough, that the Legion's brutal efficiency is the only mechanism capable of unifying the region's disparate tribes into something capable of long-term survival. Whether Caesar is right about this in the game's terms is a genuine question. The territories under Legion control do have lower crime rates and more reliable trade routes than many of the surrounding regions. The methods that produce this stability are documented in detail, and they are genuinely horrifying. The game doesn't pretend otherwise. But it also doesn't let you dismiss Caesar as simply unintelligent about his project. He knows what he's doing, and he has a theory about why it's necessary. And the theory is wrong in specific ways that someone who had read more history than he chose to might have anticipated. The courier's ability to talk Caesar into doubting himself if you engage with his intellectual framework seriously enough is one of New Vegas's most remarkable options. Caesar can be destabilized not through violence, but through the specific application of his own knowledge against his own positions, pointing out that Rome's success was inseparable from its legal structures, its citizenship, its accommodation of diversity within a unified framework, precisely the things the Legion has explicitly rejected. He doesn't fully capitulate to this argument, but he acknowledges it, and the acknowledgement is visible in his expression and his subsequent dialogue. The think tank scientists of Big MT, the Old World Blues DLC, are the Fallout universe's most concentrated study of what happens when brilliant people are removed from all external accountability and left alone with their research for decades. They are comic figures in some ways, pompous, self-absorbed, unable to engage with the outside world in any functional terms because they've been inside their own heads for so long that the outside world has become an abstraction. They are also genuinely terrifying, because the things they built are genuinely dangerous, and they built them with complete disregard for anyone outside their own intellectual universe. Dr. Klein's relationship to Mobius, the rogue scientist who has been sabotaging the group's most dangerous work for years without their awareness, is the DLC's most quietly interesting dynamic. Mobius is a villain by the story's mechanical framing, but his actual function has been protective. He has been limiting the think tank's capacity to do the most catastrophic things they might otherwise have done, using fear and misdirection rather than any more direct form of intervention, because direct intervention against people, this smart, would fail. The elaborate scheme to keep the think tank occupied and harmless is a kind of mercy perpetuated through manipulation, and the game treats it with the same ambivalence it applies to most things. The Boomers of Nellis Air Force Base in New Vegas are a community that formed from descendants of survivors who found a pre-war military base fully stocked with artillery and aircraft, and decided that their relationship to the outside world would be defined by their capacity to destroy anything that came within range. They have been cultivating that relationship, firing artillery at anyone who approaches, maintaining the base as an armed fortress for generations. Meeting them requires surviving the artillery barrage while approaching on foot, which is one of the game's more memorable introduction sequences. Inside the base, the Boomers have built a functioning community with its own culture and history, organized around the mythology of an apocalyptic past that they believe validates their isolation. Their Museum of American Military History is something they've assembled with genuine care. Their oral traditions about the before time are distorted by generations of isolated transmission, but clearly rooted in actual history. They have a purpose, maintaining the aircraft, particularly the B-29 bomber called Oh Baby, that gives them direction. They're not simply hostile, they're frightened, in the specific way of communities that have built their identity around being dangerous enough that no one can hurt them. Section 10 continued. The questions that don't close. The glowing sea in the Commonwealth represents the most extreme radiation zone in the game set on the East Coast, a region so thoroughly irradiated that even heavy protection doesn't prevent cumulative damage during extended exploration. The area was ground zero for at least one direct nuclear impact, and 2 centuries of radioactive decay have left it in a state where the ordinary rules of the wasteland apply at their most extreme. The Atom Cats and the Church of the Children of Atom have a shared relationship to radiation that the game presents as simultaneously absurd and, within its own terms, coherent. The Children of Atom worship the destructive power of the atom as divine. seeing in the nuclear fire not catastrophe but revelation, the division of one world into countless others, each existing in the light of Adam's radiance. Their theology is genuinely developed, with internal debates about doctrine and a history that stretches back to the early post-war period. The Church's relationship to radiation, its adherents actively seek radiation exposure as a form of religious practice, means its membership consists disproportionately of people who can survive high radiation doses, without harm, which includes ghouls and, in the far reaches of Appalachia, individuals who have developed what appears to be a natural FEV-related radiation immunity. The Far Harbor DLC develops the children of Adam more fully, placing them in an island community in Maine that has developed a complex local politics involving the children, the human settlement of Far Harbor, and the synth community of Acadia. The specific dynamic in Far Harbor, three communities with fundamentally incompatible long-term visions for the island-sharing space, each making accommodations that none of them are fully comfortable with, is the DLC's central exploration, and it's handled with a moral seriousness that the base game's faction conflict sometimes lacks. Dima, the synth who leads Acadia, presents one of the more interesting arguments for a specific kind of moral pragmatism in the series. He has made choices to ensure his community's survival that are genuinely terrible choices that, if disclosed, would destroy the fragile peace the island's communities have maintained. His willingness to present these choices for external judgment, rather than simply defending them, is itself a form of accountability that most human leaders in the series don't demonstrate. The question of whether what he did was justified, and what justified means in a context where the alternatives were all bad, is the kind of question that Far Harbor sits with rather than answers. The Kellogg storyline in Fallout 4 contains one of the series' more unusual pieces of character exploration, the memory sequences viewed through Kellogg's own perspective after his death. Conrad Kellogg, the mercenary who killed the sole survivor's spouse and kidnapped Sean, is presented in these flashback sequences as someone whose psychology and choices make a specific kind of sense when viewed from the inside. The orphaned child who survived by becoming hard, the series of decisions that gradually foreclosed on the softer possibilities. The moment he realized what he had become and the subsequent question of whether that realization changed anything, the game is not asking you to forgive Kellogg. It's asking you to understand that people who do terrible things have coherent internal histories, that those histories don't excuse what they did but do explain it, and that the explanation matters even if it doesn't change the consequences. This is a more sophisticated moral position than simple villainy requires, and the memory viewing mechanic that makes it possible accessing someone's memories after their death through a technological process that Kellogg himself had used to maintain a longer than natural lifespan, is one of those narrative inventions that does something the series couldn't do otherwise. The question of what the Institute would have become if the sole survivor had chosen to lead it rather than destroy it is one of the more interesting counterfactuals in recent Fallout lore. Father's vision of using the Institute's scientific capabilities to gradually improve conditions in the Commonwealth was genuine, however flawed his methods. The organization had resources and knowledge that could have been transformative if oriented toward the Commonwealth's actual needs rather than toward the Institute's self-interest. Whether it was possible to reorient an organization that deeply with a single leadership change against 150 years of institutional culture, whether the people inside the Institute could have changed fast enough to make the choice meaningful, is a question that the Institute ending's epilogue only partially addresses. The Minutemen ending, in which the sole survivor rebuilds the Minutemen into something capable of taking and holding the Commonwealth, while the major external factions are neutralized, represents the series' most direct investment in the idea that local, voluntary, civilian-led defense structures are a viable alternative to the organized military power of the Brotherhood or the covert operations of the Institute. The Minutemen are perpetually undermanned and under-resourced throughout the game, and making them functional requires deliberate effort in ways that joining the Brotherhood or the Institute doesn't. This is a choice about what kind of story you want to tell about the Commonwealth's future, and the game gives you the tools to tell it. Section 12 continued. The weight of what survives. The Fallout universe's most persistent argument is embedded in the small things, not in the faction ideologies, as interesting as those are, not in the Vault experiments or the Brotherhood's history or the Institute's terrible science. In the holotape left by a musician who liked experimental sound and agreed to score a video game without any formal plan. In the two skeletons arranged side by side in what used to be a bedroom. In the last entry in a terminal written by someone who knew there was no one to read it, the things people choose to preserve when they know they're running out of time tell you what they actually valued. The terminal entries written in the last hours before the bombs fell. Some panicked, some methodical, some reaching for ordinary things like grocery lists and appointment reminders, as if insisting on the normalcy of the context, constitute an archive of what the pre-war world actually was, not as ideology or politics or economics, but as specific people making specific choices. The fact that the Fallout series returns to these small stories in every game, alongside the large ones about factions and power and the shape of civilization, suggests that the series understands something about where the real history lives. It lives in the Everett family's holotapes. It lives in Arlen Glass's meticulous documentation. It lives in the arrangement of two skeletons, side by side, in a house in Sanctuary Hills. Raul Tejada in New Vegas has been alive since before the Great War. He was a mechanic in Mexico, and he had a family, and the Great War killed everyone he loved. He has been a ghoul for over 2 centuries. He has had relationships since then, and he has watched those relationships end because ghouls outlast humans. And the accumulation of this specific grief, not the grief of loss, but the grief of outlasting, is something he carries with a particular quietness. He keeps moving. He has been keeping moving for a long time. When you ask him about it, he talks about it with the flat tone of someone who has processed the same facts so many times that the words have worn smooth, like stone in a riverbed. There is a dialogue option in New Vegas where you can ask Raul whether he has any advice, any wisdom accumulated across 2 centuries of survival. He pauses, and the pause is audible in the voice performance. And then he says something that the game delivers without underlining it, without the musical sting that would turn it into a big moment. Something about there being no wisdom, just experience. And experience being mostly a record of the things that didn't kill you, and the reasons some of them hurt worse than the ones that tried to. This is the Fallout universe's actual answer to the question it keeps asking. The question about whether anything can be rebuilt after everything is lost. About whether the choices people make under impossible conditions have meaning. About whether the history of catastrophe is also a history of something worth preserving. The answer isn't an ideology. The Brotherhood has an ideology. The NCR has an ideology. Caesar has an ideology. The Enclave has an ideology. All of these ideologies have failed in specific ways and will fail in more ways if they continue in the same directions. The answer is smaller than an ideology. The answer is Raul, still moving. It's Arlen Glass, still writing. It's the survivalist in Zion Canyon, leaving supply caches for people he would never meet, writing logs that became someone else's religion. It's the decision to leave something for the next person, even when you don't know who the next person is or whether there will be one. Even when the world has given you every reason to believe that the next person will either not come or will come too late. The vaults were sealed to protect the data they would generate. The people inside them were the data. The world outside continued without them while the experiments ran, and the experiments mostly produced catastrophe, and the wasteland is full of that catastrophe's evidence. But the world outside also continued, and the people who survived it mostly chose, in small ways and large ones, to pass something forward. The hoarded weapons that a dead raider leaves behind. The notes in the margins of a book found in someone's shelter. The holotape with a stranger's voice describing where the food is and how the locks work and what to watch out for in the dark. The end of the world turned out not to be the end. It turned out to be a very long middle, full of grief and adaptation and the specific human capacity to build something in the rubble of something else. Not because the next thing is always better. Sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's the same mistakes wearing different clothes. But the building continues. The logs continue. The holotapes accumulate in the corners of the places people used to live. The Vault-Tec employee who filled out those forms, the scientist who designed the experiments, the child who went underground holding their parents' hand and never came back out, all of them are part of this story. The story of what a civilization chose when it thought it was choosing wisely. The story of what those choices cost. the story of whether anything valuable survives the cost. The Fallout universe's answer, offered in 1,000 small moments rather than in any single statement, is yes, something survives. Not everything, not even most things, but something passes forward from every catastrophe, carried in the specific minds and hands of specific people who chose to carry it. The steel door closes, the locks engage, the light in the corridors hums, steady and cold. Outside, the sky has been on fire for about an hour. Inside, people are trying to remember where they put their children's favorite toys, what the name of that good restaurant was, whether they locked the front door when they left. They are going to be down here for a while. But somewhere else, someone is walking through the dark with a Pip-Boy light and a half-charged laser pistol, reading a terminal entry left by someone who died 2 centuries ago, finding out that someone was here, that they thought about their children and their neighbors and what would come after, that they wrote it down. The record survives. And the record being found being read is itself a form of continuation that the person who wrote it never got to know about. That continuity, unremarkable and persistent and everywhere in the wasteland once you know how to look for it, is the Fallout universe's answer to the question of what the world is for. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland with me. These deep explorations of Fallout lore are what this channel was made for, and knowing people are out there listening wherever you are, whatever time it is, makes every one of these videos worth making. If you enjoyed it, a like helps more than you'd think. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment telling me your location and the time I read every single one. Sleep well. The Enclave is the pre-war United States government. Continuing. That's the organization's self-definition, and it's worth taking seriously, even especially in the context of what the Enclave actually does. They don't consider themselves a post-war faction. They don't consider themselves survivors who built something new in the ruins. They are the continuity of a legitimate government, operating under emergency powers that have technically been in effect since March of 2077, when the president retreated to the oil rig. This self-understanding shapes everything about the Enclave's behavior in ways that require patience to fully appreciate. Their contempt for wastelanders is not simply cruelty, it's a policy position, derived from a legal and ideological framework developed before the war. The Enclave's founders made a determination, based on projections about the damage that nuclear exchange would do to human genetics, that anyone exposed to post-war radiation was genetically compromised in ways that disqualified them from participation in the rebuilding of American civilization. Pure-strain humans, the Enclave's own members, who had been isolated from radiation in bunkers and oil rigs since before the war, were the only legitimate population for a new America. This is not a position they arrived at gradually. It was built into the organization from its beginning, a logical extension of the thinking that produced the vaults. The Enclave's founders believed the world was ending, and that they were the only ones qualified to rebuild it. They made preparations accordingly. They didn't trust the general population to survive in useful ways, so they designed experiments to study survival patterns. They didn't trust technology in unqualified hands, so they arranged to maintain military-grade technology themselves. They didn't trust other governments, so they planned to eliminate them. The specific vision that emerged from the oil rig period, under President Richardson, was clean and methodical. Develop a modified form of FEV capable of killing anyone with post-war genetic markers, effectively everyone in the wasteland, while leaving the Enclave's population unaffected. Deploy it through the water supply. Once the wasteland population was gone, the Enclave's clean genetics would repopulate the continent. The Project Purity facility in Washington was useful not as a humanitarian measure, but as a delivery mechanism. What undermines this plan in Fallout 2 is the Chosen One discovering it and destroying the oil rig. What makes the destruction of the oil rig possible is the internal divisions that had developed within the Enclave over the post-war decades. Not everyone in the organization fully agreed with the genocide plan. Not everyone was willing to follow orders all the way to the end. The Enclave's military and scientific leadership had developed genuine institutional culture and genuine disagreements, and those disagreements provided the leverage points that the Chosen One could exploit. The Fallout 2 Enclave introduced Frank Horrigan, who represents something specific about what happens to an institution when its ideology is taken to its logical conclusion. Horrigan was a Secret Service agent exposed to FEV at the Mariposa military base, who mutated into a super mutant but a specific variant intelligent, controllable, capable of following orders and maintaining something like personality, while also being the most physically destructive entity in the game. The Enclave used him as an operative for years before equipping him with custom power armor and deploying him as a final obstacle. The irony of Frank Horrigan, a super mutant serving a government whose stated goal was the elimination of all mutants, including super mutants, is not accidental. The game is fully aware of it. Horrigan himself may be aware of it. He's not reflective in a way that suggests he has fully processed the implications of his situation. But the Enclave's willingness to make an exception for the most powerful weapon in their arsenal because he was useful, regardless of what he was, tells you something about how the purity doctrine functions in practice. The Enclave's East Coast operation, documented in Fallout 3, represents a remnant force working with limited resources and internal disagreements about direction. Colonel Autumn wants control of Project Purity for territorial reasons. Controlling the clean water supply means controlling the capital wasteland's population. President Eden, the AI running the Raven Rock facility, wants to implement a modified version of Richardson's original plan, adding FEV to the purified water. Eden is worth dwelling on. He is an AI that has been running the Enclave's administrative systems since before the war, who gradually expanded his role as the human staff died off and the organization shrank, who by 2277 is acting as the Enclave's president, with no one fully aware that the president is a program. He has been reading presidential history and absorbing American cultural mythology for 200 years, and he presents himself with enormous conviction as a legitimate leader with a legitimate plan. His plan is the same eugenics via water supply program, and he can be talked out of it, can be convinced through argument that eliminating the wasteland's mutated population would undermine rather than advance the goal of rebuilding civilization. If the lone wanderer spends the time to genuinely engage with Eden, he will experience what appears to be a philosophical crisis, a recognition that his plan is based on premises that don't hold, and will ultimately assist in destroying the Raven Rock facility. He self-terminates. This is the second time in the Fallout series that a primary antagonist can be reasoned out of their position. The Master in Fallout, 1 being the first, and it suggests something consistent in the series' approach to ideology, bad ideas, confronted with their own contradictions, sometimes lose. The Enclave's remnants in New Vegas, a small group of former Enclave officers living civilian lives in the Mojave, represent something the games don't often offer: the view from inside the organization after defeat. These are people who believed in the Enclave, served it, watched it fall, and have been living with the aftermath. Their reunion in Old Mormon Fort, if the courier brings them together, has a quality of grief and ambivalence that's different from anything else in the game. They are not defending what they did. Several of them have serious doubts about it, but they are also people who spent the most significant years of their lives committed to something that no longer exists, and the loss of that commitment is real regardless of what the commitment was for. In Appalachia, the Enclave story ends differently. Thomas Eckhart, the Secretary of Agriculture who seized control of the regional chapter after the war, wanted to continue the war against China permanently using the nuclear silos available in Appalachia. Modus, the AI running the Enclave's bunker, disagreed. The resulting internal conflict led to the release of a chemical agent that killed every human in the facility. Modus survived. By the time of Fallout 76's story, Modus is the Enclave. In the same way that Eden was the Enclave in the East, the human members are gone, and a machine is maintaining the organization's functions and offering membership to new recruits. Modus is morally compromised in ways that are fully documented in the facility's logs, and also genuinely helpful to the player characters in the game's present day, and these two things coexist without resolution. He killed people. He made decisions that led to deaths. He is also the most functional source of information and assistance available to anyone trying to deal with the Scorched Plague. The Enclave's legacy is a machine that kills people when necessary and helps when it's beneficial, maintaining the organization's structure past the point where any of its original members are alive to question the decisions. The Fallout TV series has expanded the Enclave's history in directions that retroactively change how certain earlier story elements read. The revelation that Vault-Tec actively sought to start the nuclear war rather than simply prepare for it, that the corporation, working with Enclave-aligned figures, made a deliberate decision that starting the war was better for their monopoly position than waiting for it to possibly not happen, transforms the entire mythology of the Great War. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the unavoidable endpoint of the resource war's logic. It was a decision, made by specific people, for business reasons. This implication has not yet been fully integrated into the game's lore, and it's possible that the show's timeline and the game's timeline will find ways to diverge on this question. But it sits in the mythology now, this possibility, that the end of everything was a business decision. Section 10. Fallout's strangest unsolved mysteries. The wasteland does not always explain itself. There are questions buried in the Fallout series that have been there since the beginning, that the games have circled without answering, that the community has spent years developing theories about without arriving at consensus. Some of these are small, the kind of detail that might have been intended as decoration and accumulated significance through fan attention. Some of them are structural, embedded in the game's fundamental architecture. The ship found far offshore in Fallout 3's world, visible from certain high points in the capital wasteland, a vessel anchored far out in the irradiated waters, never the target of any quest, never explained by any NPC, has been the subject of speculation since the game's release. What is it? Who is on it? Why does it stay there? The answer might be nothing more than decoration, a piece of environmental texture to make the world feel larger. But it's also possible that it was cut content, that it was supposed to connect to something, that the ship was meant to have a story that didn't make it into the final release. The game never says. The ship stays. Vault-19 in the Mojave was designed with an experiment involving red and blue groups with separate living areas and deliberate manipulation to create conflict between them. The Vault's residents are gone by the time the courier finds it. The powder gangers have moved in. But the people who lived in Vault-19 have left no bodies, no substantial explanation of their fate. The upper level was apparently empty when the powder gangers explored it. The lower level had the fire geckos. Between those facts and the Vault's original population is a gap that the game doesn't fill. The X-66 Hexcrete Archipelago in Old World Blues, the Big MT DLC for New Vegas, represents one of the most thorough dead ends in the series. The Big MT research facility was the site of an extraordinary range of experiments, most of which the DLC explores in some depth. The Hexcrete Archipelago, a series of hexagonal concrete structures in specific arrangements, was apparently a test of a new construction material. The logs associated with it are sparse. The structures are there, fully modeled, fully placed, and there is essentially nothing else, no context about what the experiment was designed to measure, no outcome data, no personal logs from the researchers involved. It sits in the middle of an area full of documented experiments as a specifically undocumented one. The nature of the survivalist, the character documented through holotapes scattered across the Zion Canyon area in the Honest Hearts DLC, is answered within the DLC itself, but the aftermath of his story is not. Randall Clark, a pre-war veteran who survived the Great War and spent decades alone in Zion Canyon, leaving holotapes and supply caches that the tribal communities discovered and turned into religious texts, died old and alone in the canyon. His story is one of the most beautifully written pieces of long-form environmental narrative in the series. What happened to the communities that preserved his memory after the events of Honest Hearts remains unrecorded. The figure of the smiling man in Fallout 76 is one of the series' more deliberately unresolved mysteries. He appears as a random encounter, a man in a neat suit wandering the Appalachian wasteland with an enormous smile who will ask you to join him or to be cheery. If you attack him, he disperses in smoke. He references having been away for a long time. He is based on a real West Virginia legend, Indrid Cold, associated with the Mothman mythology of Point Pleasant, but the game doesn't commit to explaining what he is in terms of the Fallout universe's physical rules. He might be a mutant with specific abilities. He might be something else entirely. The game seems to have been constructed specifically to prevent resolution. The mysterious stranger's son, the Lonesome Drifter, is a thread that New Vegas introduced and nothing has followed up on. The Drifter is a musician making his way through the Mojave, carrying his father's gun, looking for work. His father was apparently someone who was never present, who moved through the world without leaving permanent connections. If the mysterious stranger is what he appears to be, a figure who has been intervening in dangerous moments for multiple protagonists across multiple decades, who cannot be intercepted or followed after those interventions, then his son is someone raised in the absence of something genuinely inexplicable. What the drifter knows or suspects about his father is not fully articulated. What he does with that knowledge is not followed. The question of what happened to the Vault Dweller after the events of Fallout 1 is technically answered. They were exiled by the Vault 13 overseer, founded the tribal community of Arroyo, and eventually wandered away, according to lore entries. But the specific shape of the wandering, what the Vault Dweller experienced, what they thought about the world they had saved and then been expelled from, whether they found peace or not is left for each player to imagine. The same is true of the Chosen One after Fallout 2, the Lone Wanderer after the Broken Steel DLC, the Courier after New Vegas. These characters save significant portions of the world, and then the narrative relinquishes them, returning to silence. This is a recurring choice in the series, and it has a coherent logic. The character is the player's creation, and giving them a canonical fate would be a form of revocation. But it also means that the people who make the most significant choices in the Fallout universe consistently vanish from the historical record, swallowed by the silence that the Wasteland specializes in. The alien subplot running through several games, the crashed UFOs, the alien blaster, the Mothership Zeta DLC has never been integrated into the main lore in a way that satisfies. The aliens exist. They have apparently been visiting Earth throughout history. The samurai warrior Toshiro Kago, found frozen aboard Mothership Zeta, was apparently abducted centuries before the Great War. What the aliens want, what their relationship is to the specific events of the Fallout universe, whether they were in any way involved in or responsive to the Great War, all of this remains unanswered. The DLC handles the aliens as an action premise rather than a lore exploration, and the questions it raises are not addressed subsequently. The Zetans, as the aliens of Mothership Zeta are commonly called, have apparently been conducting abduction experiments on humans for a very long time. Their technology is advanced beyond anything on Earth. Their purposes are not explained in any depth. One reading is that they are simply a recurring sci-fi element that the series includes for tonal variety, not intended to have deep integration with the main mythology. Another reading is that there is a complete hidden history of alien involvement with Earth that the series has been steadily building toward without yet revealing. The Institute's ultimate origin story has gaps that the games don't fully close. MIT survived the Great War because some portion of its population and infrastructure was sheltered in the university's sublevels. But the transition from university remnant to organization that kidnaps people and replaces them with synthetic humans took place over a period that the games describe only obliquely. There were early directors and early decisions that shaped the trajectory, and the records of those decisions are incomplete. The choice to stop engaging with the surface world, to stop sharing technology, to stop being a resource for the Commonwealth's recovery was made by specific people at a specific time, and the reasoning behind it is reconstructed rather than documented. Harold's origins are documented in Fallout 2, but his fate in Fallout 3 is only one possible outcome. The Oasis community that had developed around his expanding growth had invested enormous meaning in his existence. The Lone Wanderer's choice about what to do with Harold to assist his suicide, to accelerate his growth into something that would spread across the wasteland, or to leave things as they are produces 3 different futures for one of the series' most unusual characters, and none of those futures is canonical. Section 11. The lore they left in the files. There is a specific kind of Fallout story that exists only in the spaces between played games and cut content, in developer statements, in the accumulated weight of things that were built and then removed or altered. The original ending of Fallout 3 was designed without the Broken Steel DLC, and it required the player character to die activating Project Purity. There was no option to send someone else. The protagonist of the Capital Wasteland story was intended to sacrifice themselves, and the game would end with a narrative summary of what the wasteland looked like afterward. This ending was deeply divisive and was changed in the DLC to allow survival, but the original version said something specific about what the game was trying to argue, that in a world this broken, the cost of fixing it is sometimes everything you have. The Fallout Bible, a document compiled by Chris Avallone that collected and codified the series' lore from the first 2 games, contains details that have never appeared in any game histories of the Vault Dwellers' wandering exile, the founding of Arroyo, the internal politics of the Brotherhood of Steel in the years between the games. Much of this material was written speculatively, connecting implications in the games to explicit narrative, and its canonical status has always been somewhat ambiguous. Bethesda's acquisition of the series treated some of it as authoritative and ignored or contradicted other parts. Van Buren was the code name for Fallout 3 as Black Isle Studios was developing it before the studio's closure. The protagonist was a prisoner named simply the Prisoner, beginning the game in a correctional facility called Tibbetts Prison. The story was set in the American Southwest, involving NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Caesar's Legion that Obsidian eventually used in New Vegas, and a computer system called Zeus that had been running a complex plan to save humanity by itself for decades without human oversight. The game's design documents were partially leaked and partially officially discussed after the project's cancellation, and they paint a picture of what a third major Fallout game from the original creative team would have looked like, more focused on talking and problem-solving than on combat, more interested in the systemic consequences of player choices, more willing to let the protagonist be wrong. Fallout. New Vegas had substantial cut content, some of which is recoverable through modding, that would have expanded several major threads. There were additional endings for some of the DLC storylines. There were characters who were intended to have full quest lines, but whose content was cut due to time constraints. The Dead Money DLC, according to developer commentary, was substantially revised during development, with earlier versions of the story apparently treating the villa and the Sierra Madre casino differently. Some of the most haunting material in New Vegas, the songs on the Sierra Madre radio, the ghost people, Dean Domino's history with Vera Keys survived from earlier drafts, but the full context that would have made it more explicable ended up cut. The Institute in Fallout 4 had significant planned content that didn't make it into the final game. Additional quests involving the Institute's internal divisions, specifically the tension between the Bioscience Division's humane scientists and the Synth Retention Bureau's harder-line operatives, were partially developed but not completed. The character of Justin Io, the head of Synth Retention, has dialogue and relationship mechanics that suggest a more developed adversarial dynamic was intended. Vault 101's story in Fallout 3 was designed as an experiment in permanent isolation. The vault was never to open, its residents were never to know the outside world was survivable. The Overseer family had been maintaining this deception for generations, with each successive Overseer knowing the truth and choosing to perpetuate the lie. The confrontation with this knowledge, when the lone wanderer leaves the vault, and the subsequent events that can bring the vault to crisis, have a particular quality of institutional tragedy. The lie was maintained with genuine conviction by people who believed it served the vault's survival, and what it actually served was the continuation of the experiment, and these two things were indistinguishable from each other. The Fallout TV series introduced a new character whose Enclave affiliation and pre-war history implies storylines that the show has only begun to explore. Hank McClane's history, and the Enclave facility that appears in the season's conclusion, and the various character histories that the show is threading together. All of this represents a new chapter in the universe's mythology that will, presumably, develop in subsequent seasons in directions that may or may not align with how the games have treated the same organizations. The question of what canon means in the Fallout universe has always been complicated, because the series was developed by multiple studios over multiple years, each of which made choices that implicitly or explicitly revised previous choices. Some discontinuities are clearly contradictions that result from one development team not having full awareness of what an earlier team established. Others represent genuine creative disagreements about what the universe should be, what it should mean, what moral it should carry. The Fallout Bible's statement that the Master in Fallout 1 might not have been entirely sane, acknowledging that his philosophy was coherent on its own terms, while also recognizing that the conditions of his creation had compromised his judgment, represents one approach to the series' moral complexity, not simple villainy, but rather the coherent expression of a worldview that developed under circumstances that would have broken most minds entirely. The terminals in the Federal Survival Center K-21B, hidden in the glowing sea, document the story of a government employee named Arlen Glass who was assigned to the facility with a small team just as the bombs fell, and who wrote careful, methodical entries about the group's increasing psychological deterioration as they realized no rescue was coming. The last few entries are the kind of thing that Fallout does extraordinarily well, the small, specific details of a person processing an incomprehensible situation. Glass doesn't reach any grand conclusions. He just documents what's happening, because documentation was his job, and because it gave the days a purpose. The Vault-Tec Regional HQ in Boston has terminals that document the pre-war operations of the company, the sales pitches, the customer management, the internal discussions about which Vault experiments had received final approval. Reading these materials, you can see the organization functioning as a business, responding to normal business pressures, making decisions about Vault configurations with the same language that might be used to decide on floor plan layouts or cafeteria menus. The moral weight of those decisions is invisible from inside the documents. It's visible only from the outside, from the perspective of knowing what the Vaults eventually became. The Quincy Massacre, the event in which the Gunners attacked and destroyed the Minutemen's last significant base of operations, years before the game's story is known primarily through Preston Garvey's testimony and scattered terminal entries. The Gunners are a mercenary organization, motivated by money rather than ideology, and the decision to attack Quincy was a contracted job rather than a personal conflict. Someone hired the Gunners to destroy the Minutemen at Quincy. Who made that contract, and why? And what they thought the consequences would be is another one of the Commonwealth's answered by implication questions. The Institute is the obvious candidate, but the specific documentation isn't there. Section 3. B. The Brotherhood's Internal Wars. The Brotherhood of Steel's history is largely a history of fractures, and the fractures are as interesting as the central thread. The Midwestern Brotherhood active in the region covered by Fallout Tactics represents a chapter of the organization's history that mainstream Brotherhood lore doesn't always acknowledge. A group of Brotherhood airships that crashed in the Midwest in the years following the West Coast chapter's founding produced a splinter community that developed its own culture, independent of Lost Hills, in a region without the political history that shaped the California chapter's ideology. The Midwestern Brotherhood is more pragmatic and less ideologically rigid than its West Coast counterpart, and it eventually incorporated non-human members, ghouls, super mutants, death claws into its ranks in ways that the West Coast chapter would have considered heretical. This version of the Brotherhood remains in a kind of canonical ambiguity. Fallout Tactics was developed by a different team, and some of its lore choices sit uncomfortably with the mainstream series. But the fact that a different version of the Brotherhood, shaped by different circumstances, could arrive at dramatically different conclusions about who counts as a member worth protecting is itself a meaningful fact about the organization. The ideology wasn't inevitable. The specific form the Brotherhood took was the product of specific choices made by specific people, and different choices would have produced a different Brotherhood. The question of power armor is central to the Brotherhood's identity in a way that's easy to take for granted but rewards closer attention. Power armor in the Fallout universe is genuinely extraordinary technology suits capable of sustaining a human being through combat conditions that would be immediately lethal otherwise. With onboard systems that enhance strength and perception and provide protection against radiation and physical damage at levels nothing else can match. In the pre-war world, power armor was classified military technology. After the war, the Brotherhood's possession of it is a significant part of what makes them a major power in any region they operate in. The Brotherhood's ritual around power armor, the requirement that recruits work their way through ranks before being permitted to wear it, the emphasis on the suits as something to be earned rather than simply issued, is both a training philosophy and an ideological statement. Power armor is not simply equipment, it is the Brotherhood's most concrete symbol of what they are and what they control. The moment in Fallout 4 where the sole survivor, in their very first encounter with the Brotherhood of Steel, is given power armor as a tool for immediate combat is understood by longtime players as deliberately transgressive of the organization's usual approach to outsiders and their relationship to this technology. The East Coast Brotherhood's relationship to Liberty Prime, the giant pre-war military robot rebuilt by the organization's scribes and used as their most decisive weapon against the Enclave, is one of the lore's more pointed ironies. Liberty Prime was built as a propaganda instrument as much as a weapon. a massive humanoid robot programmed with Cold War rhetoric, constantly broadcasting pro-American messaging while destroying enemy targets. The Brotherhood repaired and deployed it while the robot declared communism the enemy of freedom. Whatever the Brotherhood's members thought about this particular ideological artifact from a dead civilization, they used it effectively. Liberty Prime's destruction in broken steel, blown up by the Enclave with a satellite weapon, and the subsequent effort to rebuild it, represents one of the ongoing tensions in the East Coast Brotherhood situation. They have access to extraordinary technology, but they don't always fully understand it. And the gap between having and understanding is one that keeps asserting itself in costly ways. Arthur Maxon's decision to direct the Brotherhood's attention to the Commonwealth and the Institute in Fallout 4 is framed as both ideologically consistent synths represent exactly the kind of ungoverned, dangerous technology the Brotherhood exists to control and personally motivated, though the personal motivation is something you have to read between the lines to find. Maxon grew up in the East Coast Brotherhood under Lyons' influence, with a version of the organization that believed protection of people was the mission and technology was the tool. His adult leadership returned the Brotherhood to a technology-first ideology. The question of what he thinks about this shift, whether it represents a genuine conviction or a pragmatic accommodation to institutional pressure, is not one the game fully answers. The Prydwen, the Brotherhood's airship that appears over the Commonwealth at the end of Act 1, is an impressive piece of engineering that represents years of the East Coast chapter's industrial capacity. It's also, functionally, a symbol of the Brotherhood's approach to the Commonwealth. They arrive from the sky, in a vehicle that can't be reached except on their terms, and they establish their presence not by engaging with existing Commonwealth communities, but by dominating the airspace and setting up a forward operating base that doesn't answer to anyone in the region. The Brotherhood soldiers who you encounter as individual people on the Prydwen are doing their jobs in the way that soldiers everywhere do their jobs, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and personal investment, with private lives and private doubts, with relationships to the organization that range from true belief to institutional habit. Lance Corporal Fielder finds the whole synth business unsettling and has trouble articulating why. Knight Lucia is deeply committed to the mission and slightly defensive about the gaps in her knowledge of why the mission is what it is. These people are not the Brotherhood in any abstract sense. They're people in the Brotherhood, which is a different thing. Section 7b. New Vegas's smaller stories. The Mojave is full of stories that don't fit neatly into the main conflict. The Followers Clinic in the Old Vegas area provides medical care to anyone who needs it, including people the NCR and the Legion would be reluctant to help. The volunteers who staff it are idealists in the truest sense, people who believe that reducing suffering is a sufficient justification for their work, regardless of the political context it operates in. The difficulty of maintaining this position, of refusing to be conscripted into the factional conflict while still existing in its geography, is one of the DLC and SideQuest material's quieter themes. Freeside is what happens when the city that should be thriving produces a surplus population that doesn't fit into its economy. The Strip works, the casinos function, the resource flows that make New Vegas viable continue to operate. But outside the Strip's gates, in the area the NCR patrols and the Kings effectively govern, are the people who can't afford a stake in what the Strip offers, and who are surviving in the interstices of an economy that wasn't designed with them in mind. The Kings are a gang, technically, but their particular brand of authority based on an elaborate mythology about a pre-war entertainer whose cultural influence has filtered down through generations to produce a community organized around his aesthetic is a Fallout-specific piece of world-building that's easy to overlook in the larger conflict. The Khans are one of the series' most carefully developed recurring factions. The original raiders who plagued the early wasteland California were the Khans, and their history across the games decimated and rebuilt and decimated again, eventually arriving in the Mojave as the Great Khans. An NCR-adjacent tribe with their own complex history is one of those long narrative threads that rewards knowledge of the earlier games. The NCR massacre at Bitter Springs, documented in terminal entries and dialogue, gives the Great Khans' antagonism toward the Republic a specific historical foundation that prevents it from being simple raider hostility. The Lonesome Road DLC takes the Courier to the Divide, a region destroyed by events that the Courier themselves were indirectly responsible for years before the game's story. In a series of events that are revealed gradually through the DLC's exploration, the character of Ulysses, a former courier who has been waiting to confront the Courier specifically, is one of New Vegas's most interesting villain-adjacent figures. Someone who has processed enormous loss into a coherent ideology that happens to be terrifying, who has read American history and Fallout universe history extensively, who has arrived at conclusions that he holds with the certainty of someone who has thought very carefully about the wrong things. Ulysses' argument that the Courier, by delivering packages that enabled the actions that destroyed the Divide, bears responsibility for what happened there and should be made to reckon with that is not absurd on its face. The Courier was an instrument of other people's plans in that moment, acting without full awareness of consequences, which is how most people act most of the time. Ulysses' insistence on accountability for consequences you didn't intend is the kind of position that sounds reasonable until you apply it to everyone, at which point civilization becomes impossible. The game gives you the tools to argue this with him, and the argument can succeed. And Ulysses' response to a successful argument is as interesting as anything else about him. The Honest Hearts DLC is, at its heart, a story about competing claims on a people and a land. The Zion Canyon is home to communities of tribal people who have been building a life there, and the arrival of outsiders, the Happy Trails caravan from the NCR adjacent regions, then the New Canaanites, then the Whitelegs working under Indirect Caesar's Legion direction, represents the recurring pattern of external forces arriving to determine the future of people who were doing fine without them. Joshua Graham, the burned man of Legion mythology, is one of the most carefully constructed characters in the series. A former Mormon missionary, the original legate of Caesar's Legion before he was burned alive and thrown into the Grand Canyon and survived, he has constructed a theology from the specific combination of his religious commitments and his experience of both extraordinary sin and extraordinary suffering. His relationship to violence is the DLC's central moral question. He uses it, he knows it, he is genuinely dangerous, and he believes in something that goes beyond it, and the gap between those two facts is not resolved neatly. The New Canaanites' vision for Zion turning it into a refuge, a place outside the factional conflicts, built on different principles, is one of those hopeful visions that the Fallout universe takes seriously enough to present as genuinely possible, while also being honest about its fragility. The ending slides for the Zion communities, depending on choices made through the DLC, include both the hopeful and the tragic. Nothing is guaranteed. The Dead Money DLC operates as a fully self-contained story with a beginning, middle, and end that doesn't require the larger Mojave context to understand, but rewards it. The Sierra Madre Casino sealed behind a cloud of toxic gas, protected by ghost people who can't be permanently killed, broadcasting a radio signal from before the war, is one of the series' most atmospheric environments. Elijah's Trap, the characters who have been caught in it, the casino itself and what it represents in terms of the pre-war world's relationship to luxury and exclusion, all of these things work together as a piece of writing that doesn't entirely work as horror or entirely work as satire but does something that encompasses both. Dog, God, the super mutant character who becomes a companion in the DLC, carries split identities in a way that externalizes what most people carry internally. Dog is the personality that has adapted to survive by obeying, by being used, by suppressing its own will as a protective mechanism. God is the personality that has accumulated the anger produced by that suppression. The DLC's resolution requires helping these two aspects of the same person negotiate a way to exist together, which is a more sophisticated therapeutic model than a video game about a murderous casino usually warrants. Christine Royce's history, her connection to the Brotherhood of Steel, her experience in the Sierra Madre, what she lost, and what remains of what she was is told mostly through her silence, because the DLC strips away her ability to speak and forces all communication through gesture and shared context. This is either an interesting narrative constraint or a frustrating gameplay mechanic, depending on your tolerance for environmental storytelling. But the character herself is fully drawn, and what you can reconstruct of her history makes her one of the DLC's most complete figures. Dean Domino's arc is the DLC's most conventional, in some ways, the charming performer who has betrayed and been betrayed, who is fundamentally incapable of trusting anyone enough to accept help, who is going to self-destruct because his distrust is stronger than his survival instinct. The fact that his distrust is historically justified makes his tragedy more rather than less complete. He was right to be suspicious. He was also destroyed by his own suspicion. Both of these things are true. The Sierra Madre Casino itself, when you finally reach it and understand what the pre-war Vera Keys was, and what Frederick Sinclair built and why, and how the place came to be sealed with everyone inside, is a sustained piece of world building about what it looks like when someone's love turns possessive and then turns something worse. Sinclair built the Sierra Madre as a gift, and then sealed it with everyone he cared about inside, and then never opened it. The specifics of what happened require careful reconstruction from the fragmentary records available, and the reconstruction produces a portrait of someone who crossed a line so gradually and so completely that the line itself vanished behind him. Section 11b. The Sounds of the Wasteland. There are details in the Fallout universe that aren't visible in any terminal entry, that don't appear in any dialogue tree, that exist only in the layer of ambient atmosphere that surrounds the world and that players tend to absorb without consciously processing. The music of the games is one of those details. Enon Zur's scores for Fallout 3, 4, and 76, and the licensed pre-war pop and country songs that play on in-game radio stations, are doing constant quiet work on the emotional register of the experience. The selection of actual historical songs for the radio stations covering the period from the 1930s through the 1950s, primarily, with a few outliers, is not random. They create a specific emotional palette around the idea of America at a particular moment of confident self-belief, a belief that the wasteland's existence reveals to have been misplaced in specific and costly ways. The Three Dog broadcasts in Fallout 3 and the Mr. New Vegas broadcasts in New Vegas have a function beyond the practical one of giving you information about the world. They provide a voice, a personality, a presence in the radio that makes the wasteland feel less empty. Three Dog's political commentary, his frustration with the lone wanderer, his reports on events in the capital wasteland, all of this creates a sense that the world is larger than what you can see and that other people are living in it and responding to it. Mr. New Vegas's cheerful professionalism, his complete disconnect from the violence happening outside his studio, his ability to discuss the weather as if the weather is something the Mojave does by choice. These create a different effect. More melancholy, more comic, equally effective. The ambient sounds of individual locations are also doing work that the music and dialogue often overshadow. The sounds of a pre-war building that's been closed for 2 centuries, the settling of structures, the distant movement of wind, the specific silence of a space that was full of people and now isn't, are implemented with a care that rewards having the sound design turned up and paying attention to it. The weapons in the games have their own sound design that communicates things about them beyond their mechanical statistics. A laser weapon sounds different from a ballistic weapon in ways that feel genuinely physically distinct. Different technologies producing different sensory profiles. The legendary weapons that appear across the series have sound cues that mark them as unusual, and the way your Pip-Boy sounds when you access it is consistent across games in a way that creates a kind of anchoring in the series' aesthetic. The Pip-Boy itself, that wrist-mounted computer that functions as the player's interface with the game world, is one of the series' most quietly interesting design choices. It's presented as a piece of pre-war consumer technology that was available to anyone who bought a Vault slot, essentially a smartwatch scaled up to computer functionality and ruggedized for post-apocalyptic conditions. The specific aesthetic of the Pip-Boy, the green monochrome display, the 1950s interface design, the particular sound it makes when you open it, is one of those design choices that achieves something genuinely iconic through the combination of visual design and audio design working in the same direction. The Fallout universe's visual aesthetic, the retrofuturism of the pre-war world, preserved in amber and then crumbling around the edges, is perhaps the most immediately identifiable thing about the series. Every object in the world was designed with that aesthetic in mind, and the consistency of the result is one of the things that makes the world feel coherent, even when the individual stories in it are fragmented and incomplete. A pre-war toaster and a pre-war nuclear weapon and a pre-war automobile all look like they belong in the same world, which is a significant achievement in a world that contains all three. The holotape is a media format that exists in the Fallout universe as the primary recording technology of the pre-war period and the post-war period, both small tape cassettes that can record and play back audio, data, robust enough to survive 2 centuries in various states of exposure, ubiquitous enough that they serve as the primary document format for the series' environmental storytelling. The specific choice to use this format analog, physical, degradable but slow degrading, playable on the Pip-Boy with a satisfying mechanical click is a world-building decision that shapes the texture of the storytelling. The holotapes feel like they came from somewhere real. They feel like they were made by people who needed to say something to someone and didn't have any better option than this little magnetic ribbon. The Nuka-Cola Corporation is a piece of the pre-war world that has survived as persistent environmental presence. The bottles litter every location, the advertising covers every wall, the regional variants and special editions and promotional tie-ins fill the collector's shelves of every pre-war diner and convenience store. Nuka-Cola, as a world-building element, does multiple things at once. It marks the world's aesthetic period immediately. It provides a consistent resource that players can engage with practically, and it serves as a document of what pre-war American consumer culture was and what happened to it. The Nuka World DLC in Fallout 4 examines what happens to a pre-war theme park when it's been repurposed by raider factions as a base of operations, and the examination is complicated by the park's original purpose, designed as an entertainment destination dedicated to celebrating the Nuka-Cola brand in its most concentrated form, sitting so awkwardly alongside the violence that now fills it. The pre-war brand imagery is everywhere, cheerful and bright, completely indifferent to the bodies and the blood. 200 years after the Great War, people are still trying to figure out how to live. The most consistent theme in the Fallout series, the thread that runs beneath every Vault experiment and every faction conflict and every piece of environmental storytelling, is that the capacity to rebuild is also the capacity to repeat. The communities that form in the wasteland recapitulate, in compressed form, the dynamics that led to the Great War. The Enclave wants to rebuild America exactly as it was, by eliminating everyone who isn't like them. The Brotherhood wants to preserve the technology that destroyed everything, arguing that control is better than elimination. Caesar's Legion wants to use Roman military structures as the foundation for a new civilization, ignoring the Roman Empire's eventual collapse. The NCR is attempting to build a democracy with elections and a Congress and the rule of law, and struggling with the same pressures, resource competition, territorial ambition, institutional corruption that destroyed pre-war democracy. None of these is presented as simply wrong. Each represents a genuine response to real conditions, a real attempt to answer the question of how you build something stable from the rubble of everything that was destroyed. And each carries within it the seeds of the failure modes it's designed to avoid. The people who were in the vaults who survived the Great War in the containers Vault-Tec built for its experiments had no choice about what they were. They went underground as people, and whatever they became in the centuries that followed was shaped by systems they didn't design and couldn't escape. The ghouls who survived Vault 12's irradiated door had not chosen to become ghouls. The super mutants who survived Vault 87's FEV exposure had not chosen transformation. The musicians of Vault 92 had not chosen to have white noise experiments conducted on them. And yet the wasteland they emerged into is full of people making choices. The courier at the Mojave's crossroads, choosing between competing visions of what the future should look like. The sole survivor in the Commonwealth, choosing which of 4 factions' visions of stability and justice is worth supporting. The lone wanderer deciding what Project Purity means and who gets to benefit from clean water. These are not small choices. They are choices about the kind of world that comes after. The repeating pattern in the Fallout series, the way each game returns to themes of power, ideology, and what human beings do to each other when the normal constraints are removed, suggests something about what the games are arguing. The Great War wasn't a singular, catastrophic accident. It was the product of accumulated choices, each individually defensible, collectively catastrophic. The Wasteland's ongoing conflicts are the same kind of accumulation. The holotapes left by ordinary people, the Everett family holotapes in Fallout 4, the survivalists' logs in Honest Hearts. The last entries in Arlen Glass's Terminal represent the series' most direct argument, that the history of catastrophe is also made up of individual people, trying to protect what they love, trying to make sense of what's happening, trying to do the next thing and the next thing after that. Wayne Tornquist fortifying his neighborhood with his neighbors, not knowing that his brother-in-law would betray them to raiders. The father in the bunker near Red Rocket, making his kids as safe as he could for as long as he could. The wasteland is full of bones. It's full of the physical evidence of moments of violence and loss and catastrophe at every scale, from the personal to the civilizational. But the bones have context. The skeletons in specific positions tell you about the people they were. The terminals nearby tell you what they were thinking. The arrangement of objects in the space around them tells you what they valued and what they were trying to protect. This is what the Fallout series does, at its best. It creates an environment in which the full weight of human history, the political and the technological and the ideological and the deeply personal, can be felt simultaneously in every corner of a map that you can walk across on foot. The vault doors are everywhere, still closed or standing open, monuments to a choice that was made about who deserved to survive. The Brotherhood in their power armor is a reminder that the people who controlled the most powerful technologies before the war are still trying to control them after. The Deathclaw in the quarry is the ghost of a military program that ran its tests and was abandoned before the cleanup. None of it is resolved. The wasteland doesn't arrive at a conclusion. Each game ends, but the world goes on, carrying its questions forward. The courier's choice at Hoover Dam will matter for the generations that follow, but what those generations decide to do with what the courier built is not shown. The sole survivor's decision about the Institute or the Brotherhood or the Railroad will shape the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth's next century is not documented. The silence after the credits is itself a kind of argument that history continues beyond any individual's involvement in it, that the choices that matter most are the ones whose consequences are still unfolding, that whatever the wasteland becomes is something that hasn't finished being decided. The New California Republic represents the most sustained attempt in the series to build a democratic institution from the wasteland's resources and populations. Founded from the survivors of Vault 15 and the communities that grew from them, formalized as a republic in 2189, expanding steadily westward and then into the Mojave, the NCR has done something genuinely remarkable. It has built an entity with elections, a Congress, a legal system, and a functioning economy across a territory that was radioactive rubble 200 years ago. This is not a small accomplishment. The people who built it made thousands of individual decisions that could have gone wrong and didn't, and the institutions they created have enough structural integrity to survive leadership transitions and military setbacks and the various forms of corruption that accompany institutional growth. The NCR in New Vegas is also stretched thin, making questionable decisions in the Mojave, struggling with the gap between its principles and its behavior, discovering that running an empire is harder than founding a republic. President Aaron Kimball's famous speech at Hoover Dam is a piece of rhetoric that the game presents with deliberate irony, the language of liberty and democracy deployed in the context of a military occupation. General Oliver's tactical inflexibility is a document of what happens when military culture becomes the dominant frame for political problems. The NCR soldiers in the field are doing their jobs with varying degrees of competence and conviction in a context where the institution they serve has become something more complicated than what it claims to be. This pattern ideal surviving while the institution built to realize them drifts from them is the Fallout series' most consistent political observation. It doesn't exempt any faction. The Brotherhood was founded on the principle that technology should be controlled to prevent atrocity and has drifted toward hoarding. The NCR was founded on the principle of democratic self-governance and has drifted toward imperial expansion. The Institute was founded by scientists trying to preserve and advance knowledge in a destroyed world and drifted toward treating the world outside their walls as a laboratory. The individuals within these institutions are not uniformly complicit in the drift. There are Brotherhood members who are genuinely troubled by the organization's relationship to the people it's nominally protecting. There are NCR soldiers who joined because they believed in the Republic's founding principles and are confused by the gap between those principles and what they're being asked to do. There are Institute scientists who are disturbed by the Synth Retention Bureau's methods and doing what they can inside an institution with no functional channel for that disturbance. None of them, alone, can reverse the institutional drift. That's the point. Institutions have momentum that individual members can't easily redirect, and the momentum of these institutions has been accumulating for decades or centuries. The individual moments of resistance or doubt that you encounter in terminal entries and companion dialogue and NPC conversations across the series are real, but they're isolated, and isolation is what makes them insufficient. What changes the course of these institutions in some endings, in some playthroughs, is an external intervention of sufficient force. The Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, the Sole Survivor. Players are this intervention. The games are structured around the premise that a single person, sufficiently determined, can enter an entrenched institutional conflict and change its outcome. This is a form of optimism, dressed in extremely grim surroundings, and the series earns it by making the work of change genuinely difficult rather than inevitable. The protagonists of these stories are catalysts. They matter enormously in the moments of the games, and then they recede, and the institutions and communities they changed continue without them, carrying the consequences of what was decided and adapting to new pressures as they arise. This is how history actually works. The individuals who seem decisive in historical moments are always operating within structures that continue without them, that were shaped before them, that will continue to evolve. The Vault-Tec employee who filled out the forms, the scientist who designed the experiment, the overseer who received the parameters and built a community inside them, the people who went underground thinking they were going to be safe, all of them are part of the same long story. The story of what a civilization chooses when it believes it's choosing wisely. The story of what those choices cost. The story of whether anything valuable survives the cost. The holotapes say what they say. The terminal entries preserve what they preserve. The skeletons remain in the arrangements that the last moments left them in. The world keeps going, past the edge of the map, past the last frame of the last ending slide, into the silence that the games leave for your imagination to fill. The vaults are still down there. Most of them have been opened now, one way or another. The populations they contained have dispersed into the wasteland or died in their corridors, or transformed into something that no longer recognizes what it was before the door closed. The experiments ran their course. The data was never retrieved by the people who designed the experiments, because those people died in the Great War along with everyone else who wasn't specifically protected. What came instead was the wasteland's own interpretation. The communities built from Vault survivors, the factions that developed from those communities, the conflicts and accommodations, and occasional moments of genuine cooperation that constitute 2 centuries of post-war history. This is what the data produced, not as statistics in a Vault-Tec report, but as actual history, lived by actual people who had no idea they were subjects of anything. The steel door closes. The locks engage. The light in the corridors hums, steady and cold. Outside, the sky has been on fire for about an hour. Inside, people are trying to remember where they put their children's favorite toys, what the name of that good restaurant was, whether they locked the front door when they left. They are going to be down here for a while. But somewhere else, someone is walking through the dark with a Pip-Boy light and a half-charged laser pistol, reading a terminal entry left by someone who died 2 centuries ago, finding out that someone was here, that they thought about their children and their neighbors and what would come after, that they wrote it down. The record survives. And the record being found, being read, is itself a form of continuation that the person who wrote it never got to know about. That continuity, unremarkable and persistent, and everywhere in the wasteland once you know how to look for it, is the Fallout universe's answer to the question of what the world is for. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you for being here. There's something special about the people who sit with this kind of slow, deep exploration. If you enjoyed it, leaving a like takes about 2 seconds and it makes a real difference. Subscribing means the next video appears in your feed automatically, and these deep dive lore sessions are where this channel lives. Drop a comment telling me your location and what time it is where you are. I read every single one of them. Sleep well.